Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. Dead night. Have you ever wondered what happens when time stops? What it feels like to be stuck in a moment, unable to escape, unable to move forward? That's what happened to me, and the worst part is, I still don't understand why. It started one evening, just after sunset. At first, it was subtle. A flicker in the lights, maybe, or a strange hum in the air that no one could quite place. People shrugged it off. Things like that happen sometimes, right? But then it didn't stop. The flickering, the lights never came back on. And the hum grew louder until it felt like it was coming from inside my skull, ringing in my ears, vibrating through my bones. I work in the small town of Millbrook, tucked in the far west of the United States, a place where time seems to move slower than in the rest of the world. Life here is quiet, perhaps too quiet. People go about their days like clockwork, everything predictable. It was supposed to be a simple evening for me, just another shift at the diner. But when I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air that evening, I saw something strange. The sky was dark, darker than it should have been. I looked up, expecting to see the familiar stars of a clear night, but there was nothing. Just blackness. The kind of deep, oppressive darkness that feels wrong, like it's hiding something. I thought maybe I was just tired. Overworked. It had been a long week. So, I went back inside and tried to focus on the customers. The noise of clinking silverware and casual conversation should have calmed me down. But it didn't. The longer I worked, the more I noticed it, the lights, flickering again, and then staying off. The hum, louder now, pulsing through the floorboards. When I finally looked outside, the town was different. The streets were empty, not a single car in sight. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft buzz in the air. But the worst part was the sky. It hadn't changed. It was still that same, unnatural black, as if night had swallowed the sun whole and decided to never let go. I thought it was a power outage at first. A blackout. I kept telling myself that, trying to keep my panic at bay. But that didn't explain the way the darkness felt, the weight of it pressing down on everything, suffocating. The wind, which should have been a welcome relief on a hot evening, was completely still, as if the world had forgotten how to breathe. And then, the whispers started. At first, it was just a low murmur, like the wind rustling through the trees. But it quickly grew, becoming a chorus of soft voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. They were words at first, just noises. But they weren't random. They felt deliberate. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate. I couldn't understand it. The words slipped through my mind like smoke, impossible to grasp. Then, I noticed something even more unsettling. The clocks. They had all stopped. Not just the ones in the diner, but everywhere. The town streetlights, the digital signs, the watches on people's wrists, everything was frozen in time. The world had become a frozen frame, trapped in an endless night. I don't know how much time passed before I realized that something was terribly wrong. But by then, it was too late. The night had already begun to stretch and twist, folding in on itself like a living thing. The once calm streets of Millbrook had become a labyrinth, each corner darker and more suffocating than the last. I tried to leave. I packed up and drove towards the edge of town, convinced I could escape. But no matter how far I drove, the darkness followed. The hum seemed to surround me, pressing in from all sides, and when I looked out the window, it felt like the world had turned upside down. That's when I saw the first one. A shadow darted across the road in front of my car, so fast, I almost didn't see it. It was too big to be a person. Too fast. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I could hear it, whatever it was. The scraping of claws against asphalt, the faint rustle of something moving just out of sight. My mind raced. My thoughts jumbled together, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was just seeing things. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe the darkness was playing tricks on me. But the sounds didn't stop. They were getting closer. I locked the doors and kept driving, faster now, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The streetlights, those broken, flickering lights, became more erratic, flashing on and off in rapid bursts, like they were trying to tell me something. And then, just as quickly as it started, the sound stopped. The world fell back into a deathly silence. But the silence only made it worse. The tension in the air was suffocating. My breathing was shallow, my thoughts scattered, and I could feel my pulse racing, my stomach churning. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer in control. The night had taken over, and I was trapped in it, unable to escape. I stopped the car at the edge of town, just before the long stretch of road that led out into the wilderness. The headlights flickered once, then died entirely, plunging me into total darkness. I sat there, in the black void, for what felt like an eternity, just trying to breathe. Every instinct told me to get out of the car, to run. But run where? The town was no longer familiar. It had become something else, something wrong. The shadows seemed to shift in the periphery of my vision, but whenever I turned my head to look, there was nothing. Only darkness. I started the engine again, desperate for any sign of normalcy. The car sputtered, but the engine came to life, groaning in protest. I exhaled a shaky breath, hoping the worst was over. But then I saw it. A figure, darting across the road in front of my headlights. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. It wasn't human, too fast, too large, with something grotesque about the way it moved. It wasn't a person, but something else, something monstrous. It disappeared into the trees before I could even process what I had seen. I didn't think, I just floored the gas pedal, swerving around the bend and speeding down the road. The night pressed in around me like a suffocating blanket, and the air in the car seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. I told myself I was imagining things. The shadows? Just tricks of the light. The figure? A deer or some other animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. My gut twisted with the knowledge that something was out there, something waiting. As I drove, the world around me felt wrong, out of sync, like a warped reflection in a broken mirror. The lights from the car illuminated the trees and the road, but they didn't push the darkness back. The darkness crept closer, in between the beams of light, as if it had a life of its own. I tried to keep my mind calm, rational. There had to be a logical explanation for everything. A storm, perhaps, or a power surge. A malfunction in the town's electrical grid. The shadows were just shadows. The figure? A figment of my imagination. But then I heard it. A low, scratching sound from underneath the car. At first, I thought it was just a rock or debris caught in the undercarriage. But the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Scratching. Scraping. A rhythmic, continuous sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled over to the side of the road, the tires screeching as they hit the gravel. My hand shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what might be underneath the car. But something pushed me, a compulsion I couldn't explain. I had to look. I stepped out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound stopped as soon as I was out of the vehicle, leaving me in an eerie silence. I crouched down to inspect the underside of the car, my flashlight shaking in my hand. At first, I saw nothing. No broken parts, no debris. But then the light caught something. A dark smear of something wet, something viscous. It glistened in the beam of the flashlight, and my stomach churned as I realized it wasn't just dirt. It was blood. I took a step back, my eyes scanning the ground, my mind racing. Was it mine? No. I hadn't been injured. But something had been under the car. Something had left that mark. And that's when I heard it again. The scratching. Closer this time. My head snapped up, and my flashlight danced across the trees. I saw nothing at first, but then, a pair of eyes. They glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the light of my flashlight like two small, burning coals. They were too high off the ground. Too large. I froze. The eyes didn't blink. They just stared at me, unblinking, unmoving. I couldn't breathe. The world narrowed down to those eyes, and everything around me seemed to fade into the background. They were coming closer, and I knew, no, I felt that whatever it was that owned those eyes was no longer hiding. I slammed the car door shut and jumped back inside. My hands fumbled with the keys, but I couldn't get the engine to start. The hum, that low vibration I'd heard before, filled the air again, and I could feel it in my bones. Something was wrong, something I couldn't escape. Suddenly, the car jolted forward. I didn't know why. There was no one behind me, no force pulling me, but the car was moving, inching down the road on its own, as though guided by some unseen hand. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but all I saw was darkness. The eyes were gone, but I wasn't alone. I could hear them now, the scraping, the shuffling, the unmistakable sound of claws on the pavement. I had no doubt now. They were real. They weren't just in my head. Something was following me, and I didn't know how to outrun it. I floored the gas pedal, the car speeding faster down the desolate road, but the sound of scratching and skittering grew louder with every passing moment. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, curling around the edges of the headlights, as though the night itself was alive and hungry. I could feel it closing in on me. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw another figure, a shadow too big to ignore, dart across the road. I wasn't just running from it anymore. It was everywhere. Everywhere I went, they followed. The night had swallowed me whole. The car's engine roared as I sped down the road, but the screeching of claws against metal and stone grew louder with every passing second. My pulse hammered in my ears, and every corner I turned only seemed to lead me deeper into the dark, suffocating void. I could feel their presence, close, impossibly close, like something from the very ground beneath me. The weight of it pressed against my chest, suffocating me in a panic I couldn't escape. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and yet I could see them. The eyes. They glowed faintly at first, then brighter, until the entire road seemed lit by their cold, unblinking stare. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe the isolation of the night was making me lose touch with reality. Maybe the stress from the strange electrical disturbances had messed with my senses. But every instinct screamed at me that it was real. That whatever was chasing me, whatever was lurking just out of sight, was very real. I slammed my foot harder on the accelerator, desperate to escape. The car bucked and jolted, the tires screeching as they fought to grip a winding road. The trees blurred past in a mess of twisted shadows. My eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, that could explain the terror gnawing at my insides. The road stretched out in front of me, endlessly winding into the dark, but all I could see were those eyes, flickering in and out of my line of sight like some twisted vision from a nightmare. The headlights illuminated the trees, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, clawing at the sides of the car. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, deep and resonating. It echoed through the night, so close I felt it vibrate through the car's frame. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. It was coming from beneath the car. Beneath me. I slammed my foot on the brake, the car screeching to a halt. The tires locked, sending a jolt of terror through me. The scratching, that awful scraping sound, had stopped. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by my frantic breathing. But then I saw them. Two massive, glowing eyes, closer now, right in front of the car, far too close to be anything but the thing hunting me. They weren't alone. The figures emerged from the shadows like twisted monsters, their huge forms barely visible but unmistakable in their monstrous size. Their fur, matted and slick with the dark, reflected the dim light of my headlights as they moved, their shapes shifting as they slinked toward me. I couldn't move. My hands were frozen to the steering wheel, my mind refusing to process what was happening. The shadows were shifting again, more than shadows now. More than darkness. They were alive. A flash of teeth. Huge, jagged fangs glistening in the dark. I snapped back into reality. Without thinking, I threw the car into reverse, the engine roaring to life with a scream of protest. The car jerked backward, tires spinning, gravel flying in all directions. I didn't care about anything but getting away. But it was too late. The car jerked to a stop again, this time not from my own actions. Something had grabbed it. I could feel the pull, the weight, as if some unseen force was clamping around the back of the vehicle. I twisted the wheel, trying to yank the car free, but nothing worked. The sound of claws on metal filled the air again, louder now, accompanied by the low, rhythmic pounding from underneath the car. A breathless, furious growl echoed from beneath. Something was there. Something was waiting. I grabbed at the door handle, but my hands were shaking too violently to get a good grip. The cold sweat on my palms made the metal feel slick. The car shuddered again, and I heard a low scrape under the engine, a sound so deep and unnatural it made my chest ache. And then, silence. I dared to glance out the side window. The eyes. They were there, so close now that I could count the layers of grime on the glass. But there was something else in the dark, something even more terrifying. A silhouette. A hulking, distorted shadow that hovered just out of reach of my headlights, its shape wavering and shifting in ways no living creature could. My body was paralyzed by fear, but my mind screamed at me to act. Escape. Move. Run. I jerked the door open, the cold air biting at my skin, and stumbled out of the car. I couldn't waste another second. The world outside was no better than what I'd left behind in the vehicle. The forest loomed around me like a dark, suffocating maze, the trees bending unnaturally toward the ground as if reaching for me. The road, barely visible in the weak light of my flashlight, seemed endless. There was no escape. No safety. The sound of claws on gravel echoed behind me. I didn't dare look back. The growling, low and guttural, filled the air, and I knew that I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. My legs burned as I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the cold night air filling my lungs with every desperate breath. I was running blind, but every part of me screamed that it wouldn't be enough. They were too fast. Too many. The sound of their approach grew louder, closer. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard something else. A scream. A human scream. It echoed through the night, shrill and terrified. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath hitched in my throat. The scream wasn't mine, but it was real. I turned toward the sound. Somewhere in the distance, just beyond the line of trees, someone else was still trapped. And whatever had found me was finding them too. I froze. Every instinct told me to keep running, to put as much distance between myself and the nightmare behind me. But the scream, that horrible, desperate scream, kept me rooted to the spot. It wasn't the sound of someone in a fight, it was the sound of someone already lost. For a long, impossible moment, I stood there, the air around me thick with the stench of damp earth and the bitter tang of fear. The trees, twisted and gnarled, loomed above me like silent witnesses. Somewhere in the shadows, the glowing eyes waited, watching, studying. They knew I was here. A branch snapped in the distance. A faint rustle of leaves. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. The flashlight in my hand trembled as I swung it toward the sound. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body telling me to run, but my feet were glued to the earth, unwilling to move. The shadows in front of me stretched out long and menacing, shifting with every step I took. The darkness wasn't just dark anymore. It was thick, alive, almost. Then I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. The faintest scraping sound, like claws against bark, followed by a soft thud. My pulse surged in response. It was too close. Too close for comfort. The ground beneath me trembled, like something was moving, charging, beneath the surface. I turned sharply, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the forest was pressing in around me, each sound amplifying the terror that gnawed at my insides. I started to move, my legs stiff and uncoordinated, each step heavier than the last. The scream, whoever had screamed, was fading, swallowed by the oppressive silence that had returned. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. My mind raced, fighting to keep rational thought intact. There had to be an explanation. There had to be. These weren't supernatural creatures. They couldn't be. But deep down, I knew. I knew what was out there. The giant rats. The eyes, the noises, the way they moved beneath the surface, it was all too real. They had to be real. And if they were real, what was I supposed to do now? A flash of movement caught my eye. Too quick. Too fluid. And before I could react, something crashed through the underbrush to my left, nearly knocking me off my feet. My flashlight flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the trees as I spun around to face whatever had made the noise. Nothing. Empty space. But the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. The crunching sound from the direction of the scream grew louder again, now unmistakable. It was followed by a sickening series of wet sounds, like something gnawing, tearing. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to vomit. I wasn't sure what it was, but whatever it wasn't human. I ran. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hands as I sprinted through the forest, not daring to look behind me, but the echoes of footsteps followed. Slow, deliberate, as if something was tracking me, learning my pace. They were patient. Too patient. The trees around me became a blur, the path disappearing into thick underbrush. My breath came in ragged gasps, the air burning in my lungs. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet as I stumbled over rocks and roots. But all I could hear were those footsteps, growing closer, closer. Suddenly, I felt something cold graze my leg. I froze, panic seizing me, and when I looked down, I saw it. A long, slick tail, covered in matted fur, curling around my ankle. My heart leaped into my throat. Before I could scream, it yanked. I hit the ground hard, the flashlight flying from my hand and rolling out of reach. A growl, deep and menacing, sounded from somewhere behind me, and then the cold, wet feeling of claws raked across my arm. I managed to scramble to my feet, but I could barely feel the ground beneath me anymore. My heart pounded in my chest, fear clouding my mind. I couldn't think. I couldn't escape. The creature was there, its shadow looming over me, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. I just ran. The darkness was suffocating, but I had no choice but to keep moving forward. If I stopped, I would die. That much was clear. Then, in the distance, I saw it, a flicker of light. A distant glow that almost seemed like hope. A building. A house, maybe. But I didn't care. It was light. And right now, I would follow any light. The growling, the snapping of teeth, grew louder behind me, and I could feel the earth shifting beneath me, the thing following me, closer now, too close. A surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins, and I pushed myself harder, faster. The house was getting closer, but the sound of the creature's pursuit was drowning out everything else. My legs burned, my chest screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I broke through the tree line, my foot landing on something soft and damp. The glow of a small cabin loomed ahead, and I pushed myself toward it with every last ounce of energy I had left. But as I reached the door, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of claws on wood. I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't even think about it. I just grabbed the door handle, yanking it open with all my strength. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled inside, the cold rush of air from the outside filling my lungs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I would freeze in place, consumed by the terror of what was chasing me. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the small, dimly lit cabin. My hand shook as I locked it, the metal click of the deadbolt seeming too loud, too final. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in frantic gasps, and turned to take in my surroundings. The cabin was old, dust on the shelves, faded curtains drawn tight against. The dark. There was a fireplace to my right, but it hadn't been used in years. The air inside felt thick, stale, almost suffocating. It smelled of old wood and decay. I took a step forward, the floor creaking underfoot. Each noise made my skin crawl. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of safety, any hint of reassurance. But there was none. Outside, the growling had stopped. It was still. Too still. I pressed myself against the wall, my ears straining for any sound, but the silence was deafening. The cold sweat on my skin made my clothes stick to me, and the shaking wouldn't stop. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. How did this happen? Why me? A sharp click echoed through the cabin. My head snapped toward the door. Something had touched the handle. The air felt heavy, charged. I could feel it, the presence outside, pressing against the wood, waiting. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move. There was nowhere to run here. Nowhere to hide. I looked around for anything I could use, any weapon, but the cabin was sparse. A few chairs, a cracked mirror hanging on the wall, and a small kitchen area in the corner. Nothing that could defend me. I stepped closer to the window, my pulse racing. It was covered by the same thick, dusty curtains, but a faint light outside flickered. The glow of the street lamp? No. It was too erratic, too unnatural. Something was out there. A scraping sound broke through the silence. Then another. Someone was moving. The thud of heavy footsteps, growing louder, closer. My heart slammed against my ribs. The creatures were still out there. But what about the house? Was it safe? Was the door enough? The thoughts twisted and spiraled in my mind. I needed to do something. I had to make a choice. I couldn't wait any longer. With a force I didn't know I had, I grabbed the nearest chair and swung it against the window, the glass shattering with a deafening crack. A cold gust of wind swept in, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. The broken glass crunched underfoot, but there was no time to think. I climbed through the window, my body jerking as I pushed myself out of the cabin and into the yard, desperate to escape whatever was lurking inside. I landed hard on the ground, pain shooting up my legs, but I didn't stop. The woods surrounded me again, dark and oppressive, but the light from the cabin was behind me now. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my legs burning, my breath ragged, but something was wrong. I could feel them now, them not far behind. The unmistakable sounds of claws digging into the earth, the eerie, guttural growls that were too close for comfort. I had to keep moving. I had to outrun them. But I was tiring. My vision blurred, my head spun, and the terror in my chest was suffocating. Each step felt heavier than the last. I stumbled, then caught myself, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. Another step. Another. And then, something cold touched the back of my neck. I froze. The air turned frigid, the hairs on my body standing up as I felt the pressure of someone, right behind me. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. But what I saw, what I felt, was worse than anything I could have imagined. A shadow, too large to be human, moved just beyond the range of my flashlight. It was massive, like a wall of blackness, and it towered over me, its eyes glowing red like embers in the dark. The creature stepped forward, its claws scraping against the earth, the air thick with its presence. My throat tightened. There was no escape. And then, the first one lunged. I barely had time to react before I felt the cold, sharp claws sink into my flesh. A scream tore itself from my throat as pain exploded in my side, but I couldn't scream loud enough. The dark, monstrous shape of the creature loomed over me, its grotesque mouth opening to reveal rows of teeth. I tried to push it away, but it was too strong, too fast. Another one appeared from the shadows, its eyes burning with hunger. I could barely make sense of what was happening. My body was numb, my mind spinning as I fought to keep my vision focused. There was only one thought in my head now: survive. But I was failing. Everything was fading. The creatures, no, monsters, ripped into me, their claws tearing into my flesh as if I were nothing more than a piece of meat. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't. And then, silence. The pain stopped. The creatures stopped. The night was still. I wasn't sure how much time had passed before the sounds of the forest came back to life, the wind whispering through the trees, the distant rustle of leaves, but it no longer mattered. I was already gone. Dead. A silent scream echoed in the night. And the creatures, hungry, waited. The truth of darkness. The air down here always felt wrong. There was something in it, something that made my skin prickle as though the very walls of the tunnels were watching me. I was no stranger to the underground. This was my job, after all. But today, as I descended into the darkness of the New York subway system, something felt different. Unsettling. It was a quiet morning, the kind where even the usual hum of the city above felt distant, muted. The heavy iron doors of the maintenance tunnel creaked open as I stepped inside. My boots echoed on the hard concrete, the sound swallowed by the vast expanse of stone and rusted metal around me. The tunnel stretched out ahead, dark and uninviting, lit only by the flickering glow of weak overhead lights. We had been repairing these old tunnels for weeks, and the deeper we went, the more it felt like we were uncovering things that were never meant to be found. I had worked here for years, repairing cracks in the tunnels, fixing cables, and reinforcing the infrastructure that held up the weight of the city. But recently, strange things had begun happening. It was subtle at first, footsteps that weren't my own, shadows darting out of the corner of my eye. I chalked it up to exhaustion. We were working long hours, after all. But then, one morning, I heard something I couldn't ignore. A low, skittering noise, like nails scratching against stone. It came from deep within the tunnel. I paused, listening. The others didn't hear it, but I could swear I felt it, something moving, just out of sight. I remember telling myself it was just a rat. That was the easy answer. But rats don't leave tracks in the dust. At least, not tracks like these. The ground was marked with long, dark lines, as though something large and heavy had dragged itself along the floor. I followed the marks with my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. The lines led to a small, narrow side tunnel that branched off the main corridor. It had been boarded up when we first came down here, but now the boards had been pulled aside, the entrance yawning open. Just great, I muttered under my breath. Another problem. I was about to call for the others when I heard it again. A sound, distant, yet unmistakable, like a soft scraping or rustle of movement. My spine stiffened. This wasn't the sound of rats. I could feel it in the air, in the way the temperature seemed to drop. Hello? I called out into the darkness, my voice sounding absurdly small in the vast, empty tunnel. There was no answer. Just the whisper of the wind, the fluttering of something far in the distance. I stepped forward, compelled by a mix of curiosity and the gnawing feeling that if I didn't investigate, something worse would happen. The shadows stretched unnaturally, as if the very darkness was clinging to the walls, pulling me deeper. As I entered the side tunnel, the faint scent of mildew and decaying stone grew stronger. The air felt heavier, thick with something damp and rancid. But it wasn't just the smell, it was the silence. A suffocating silence, as if all sound had been swallowed by the tunnel itself. I reached for the flashlight clipped to my belt and clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing more than the old brick walls of the tunnel. But then, in the faint glow, I saw something. A shadow. It wasn't cast by anything I could see, but it moved across the wall, shifting and stretching in ways that didn't make sense. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe the fatigue was getting to me. But then, the shadow jerked, twitching, like something alive. I backed away, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My heart raced, and my hands began to sweat as I gripped the flashlight harder, hoping that the beam would somehow keep the darkness at bay. That's when I heard the sound again. The soft scrape of nails against stone. Closer this time. It wasn't a rat. I turned and ran. I didn't know what I was running from, but something in the pit of my stomach told me that whatever it was getting closer. I burst into the main tunnel, my breath ragged, the flashlight still shaking in my hand. The others were just a few yards ahead, working on the tracks, oblivious to the growing terror I felt. "Hey!" I shouted, waving them over. "We need to get out of here. Now." They looked at me, confused. "What's wrong?" one of them called back. Just get back upstairs," I said, my voice shaking. "There's something in the tunnels. Something wrong." They stared at me for a long moment, and for the first time, I realized how strange I must have looked, wide-eyed, frantic. But I didn't care. They needed to understand. The sound came again, closer, louder. The unmistakable scraping of claws against the stone. It was coming for us. "We need to leave. Right now!" I yelled, turning to run. But then, the lights flickered, once, twice, and the shadows grew longer, stretching across the walls in ways that didn't belong. And as I sprinted toward the stairs, I heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving behind me. Something fast, closing in with terrifying speed. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I could hear it, feel it, getting closer with every step I took. My heart pounded in my chest. It wasn't just the rats. It was something far worse. Something that didn't belong in the dark. We didn't talk much as we hurried back up the stairs, not a word spoken among the group. It was as if the air had thickened around us, weighing down every step we took. We barely made it to the surface when the echo of our hurried footsteps was drowned by the rising hum of the city above. For a moment, it felt like nothing had changed. The noise of New York City, the rush of cars, the distant chatter of pedestrians, everything was normal. But beneath that normalcy, something felt off. Something I couldn't shake. "Are you all right?" asked Joe, the oldest of our group, a deep crease on his weathered face. His voice sounded like he was trying to convince both of us, but it faltered under the weight of the fear I could still hear in mine. I don't know. Something's down there. Something huge." I could still feel the pressure of the air in the tunnel, the suffocating silence that had settled around us as we descended deeper. The scraping noise, that vile sound, still lingered in my ears like an echo from a dream I didn't want to wake up from. Joe, ever the skeptic, glanced at me with raised eyebrows. "You're just spooked, man. We've been working down there for weeks. It's probably just some rats or pipes. Nothing to worry about. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words caught in my throat. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. But how could I explain it? The shadows that moved without reason, the unearthly cold, the sense that something had been watching us, studying us, as we worked. Maybe. I muttered, trying to force the unease down. But I'm telling you, Joe, I felt something. It's not just rats. It's something else. Something bigger. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it. Joe sighed, his breath misting in the cool air. All right, we'll go back tomorrow. Check it out together. Maybe it's nothing. I didn't argue. What good would it do? He wouldn't believe me unless he saw it for himself. But something gnawed at me, something primal, deep in my gut, that told me we shouldn't go back. That there was something down there that was waiting for us. Watching. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, unable to shake the images from the tunnels. The shadows. The sound. And that feeling. It was like being hunted, but by something I couldn't see. My breath came shallow, my mind racing with half-formed thoughts. Suddenly, a noise jolted me from my thoughts, a sharp, scratching sound, as if nails were scraping against wood. I froze, listening. Nothing. It was just the wind. I told myself that, but my heart still pounded in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned over, trying to force myself into sleep, but the noise persisted. Soft at first, just barely audible, but then growing louder. Closer. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The scratching sound was unmistakable now. It came from the walls of the apartment. Slow, deliberate. My pulse quickened. My hand reached for the lamp by my bedside, and I flicked it on. The room flooded with light, but there was nothing there. Just the quiet stillness of my apartment. I sighed in relief. It was probably just old pipes. Nothing to worry about. But as I lay back down, trying to calm my nerves, I heard it again, a soft tapping. A movement. Just beyond the edge of the light. I jumped out of bed, heart racing. The room felt different now. It was too quiet, like the entire apartment had been swallowed by the silence. I paced the room, running a hand through my hair. Something wasn't right. Something was in here, in my apartment, moving where it shouldn't be. But when I turned around, the room was empty. Still. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes fell upon the corner of the room near the window. The shadows seemed thicker there. More solid. More deliberate. Like they were clinging to the walls, curling like fingers reaching out. I took a hesitant step back, my body tense. The shadows seemed to stretch toward me, pooling on the floor like ink, and then I saw it. A pair of eyes. They gleamed from the darkness, reflecting the light from the lamp. Eyes that shouldn't have been there, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as they blinked slowly, deliberately. The eyes blinked again, and in that moment, I knew they weren't human. They were wrong, unnatural. Something far worse than rats, far worse than anything I had encountered before. The silence shattered with the sound of a crash. The noise was so sudden, so deafening, that I nearly fell to the floor in shock. My eyes snapped back to the corner, but the eyes were gone. The shadows, too, had receded, leaving only the empty space. I stumbled back toward the door, my legs weak, and I finally let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But then I saw it, a long, dark shape slithering across the floor, just beyond the reach of the light. It wasn't a rat. It was bigger. Bigger than anything that should have fit in this room. With a cry of terror, I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I yanked the door open, I glanced back just in time to see the thing vanish into the shadows, leaving nothing but the sound of scratching nails and the faint scent of decay. I ran out into the hallway, the fear still gripping me. But what could I do? I was alone, trapped in this apartment with whatever that thing was. It was here, in the city. It was in the walls. It was below us, moving, waiting. I knew now that whatever we had disturbed in the tunnels had followed us out. And it wasn't just rats. The hours passed in a blur after that night. My mind wouldn't stop racing. Every creak, every shift of the building seemed amplified. The scratching sound still echoed in my ears, and every shadow felt like it was hiding something, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching, waiting for me to slip up. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those eyes again, those gleaming, unnatural eyes that had stared at me from the shadows. They were still out there, somewhere, in the dark. I couldn't shake it. By the time I made it back to the worksite the next day, I was a wreck. My hands shook as I grabbed my gear, my mind still clouded by what had happened. But I knew I had to face it. I had to go back down into the tunnels. I had to know what was happening, what we had awoken. Joe had noticed my condition immediately. "You okay, man? You look like hell," he said, his voice low with concern. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a weak smile. I wasn't fine. None of us were fine. Not after last night. Joe frowned, but didn't press the issue. He led the way into the tunnels, his heavy boots echoing against the cold concrete floor. The rest of the crew followed, but I could see it in their eyes. They were nervous, too. The air down here was thick with tension, something none of us could quite place. We set up our equipment, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that had settled over us like a dark cloud. The tunnels had never felt this oppressive before. The faint scraping sounds from the previous day were gone, but there was something else, something just beyond the edge of hearing. The silence was suffocating, as if the walls themselves were listening. I tried to keep my focus, my hands trembling slightly as I worked. But every time I looked down the long, dark stretches of the tunnel, I felt a creeping sensation that something was watching me, something that shouldn't be there. "Joe," I said, my voice tight with unease, "maybe we should just leave. This isn't right. There's something down here. Something not normal." Joe turned to me, his face hardening with impatience. "You're still on about that? Come on, we've been through worse. You're letting your imagination get the best of you." But his voice faltered slightly, and I saw the unease in his eyes. He couldn't deny it. We had all heard it, the faint, eerie sounds that had seemed to come from nowhere. The way the shadows had twisted, as if they were alive. The first sign that something was wrong came when we reached the farthest section of the tunnel. There, in the dim light of our flashlights, we saw the first sign of damage. The walls were torn up, the metal supports twisted and bent as if something enormous had shoved them aside. The ground was littered with scraps of torn insulation, broken cables, and shredded equipment. "That wasn't here yesterday," Joe said, his voice low, eyes scanning the wreckage. I stepped forward, my stomach churning. Something was off. The damage didn't look accidental. It was too deliberate. Like something had intentionally destroyed everything in its path. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my panic in check. Joe, this isn't just rats. This is something else. Joe didn't respond, his gaze locked on the wreckage. Then, as if in answer to my words, we heard it. A deep, guttural growl. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a shock of fear through me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was coming from somewhere in the dark, deep in the tunnel, just beyond the reach of our lights. For a moment, no one moved. We all stood there, frozen in place, listening. The growl came again, this time louder, more distinct. It was low, like the growl of an animal, but deeper, unnatural. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered, but their voice was swallowed by the growing tension in the air. Before anyone could respond, the ground shook. A low rumble, like the tremor of an earthquake, reverberated through the tunnel. I staggered back, nearly losing my footing. The lights flickered. Then the walls cracked. A loud, sharp crack echoed through the tunnel, followed by a series of smaller tremors. The floor shifted beneath our feet, and I could hear the sound of something massive moving just below us. The growl intensified, now accompanied by the sound of scraping claws on stone. Panic erupted. "Move!" Joe shouted. "Get out of here!" We turned and ran, but the tunnel was narrowing, closing in on us. The walls seemed to press in from both sides, and the air grew thick with dust and the stench of something rotten. The sound of footsteps behind us was deafening, louder than any of us, yet somehow wrong. They didn't sound human. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. Something was chasing us, something monstrous. The ground trembled beneath us, and the scraping, growling sound echoed, growing closer. I pushed forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but my legs were giving out. The sound of clawed feet scraping against stone was closing in, too close. The tunnel ahead seemed endless. The exit was so far away. "Joe!" I shouted, but there was no answer. I glanced over my shoulder just as a shape emerged from the darkness, a massive, hulking figure. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, reflecting the flashlight's glow like molten silver. It was a rat, but not like any rat I had ever seen. This creature was bigger than a man, its body twisted and grotesque, with sharp, jagged teeth that glistened in the light. Its claws scraped against the ground as it loped toward us with terrifying speed. I felt my heart freeze in my chest. There was no way we could outrun it. Then, just as I thought all hope was lost, I heard a voice, faint, desperate. "Run, just run, don't stop." We didn't stop running. Not even while our lungs burned and our legs screamed in protest. We just kept moving, stumbling over debris, not daring to look back at the creature pursuing us through the darkness. The screech of claws on stone grew louder, closer with every passing second. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. The tunnel ahead was a blur of shadow and dim light, but I could barely make out the others in front of me. Joe, Marco, and a few of the other guys were ahead, but it was clear we weren't going to make it out if we didn't do something fast. "Joe!" I screamed, my voice barely carrying over the noise of our frantic footsteps. "We need to split up. It's too fast. There's no way we'll all make it out together." Joe didn't respond. I couldn't even see his face, but I could hear his labored breathing. He was just as terrified as I was. Behind us, the growl of the creature grew more desperate, as if it knew it was closing in on its prey. Then, the floor gave way. Without warning, the ground beneath me shifted, and I was falling. I tried to scream, but the air rushed out of my lungs. My body slammed against something hard, stone, rock, and I heard the sounds of others crashing down behind me. A loud, painful thud reverberated through my chest as I hit the ground, followed by a chorus of grunts and yelps from the others. When I opened my eyes, all I could see was darkness. For a moment, I thought I was dead. My head was spinning, and my chest felt tight. It took several long seconds for the world to come into focus, for my ears to stop ringing. The others were groaning around me. Marco was clutching his leg, which was twisted at an odd angle. Joe was trying to sit up, but he winced with every movement. I tried to get to my feet, but I could barely stand. My knees buckled beneath me, and I had to brace myself against the jagged rocks. What the hell just happened? I muttered, my voice hoarse. The fall had been so sudden. 1 minute, I was running for my life. The next, I was lying in some kind of underground cavern. Joe groaned, then gritted his teeth as he pushed himself upright. The ground, it just broke open. Damn thing must have been tunneling below us. I turned my head, scanning the dark space around us. My flashlight flickered, casting weak beams of light against the walls of the cavern. The place was massive. It felt like we were in the bowels of the earth, like some kind of forgotten, ancient space. The walls of the cavern were smooth, slick with moisture, and the floor was uneven, littered with jagged rocks and debris. There was no way out, no clear path. We were trapped. Above us, the sound of something scraping against the tunnel's walls grew louder. The creature had found us. I froze, listening, my breath catching in my throat. The growl echoed through the cavern, low and deep, like the sound of an animal ready to tear into its prey. But it was different this time, closer. Much closer. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. My heart raced. It was no longer a distant terror, it was right on top of us. "Joe," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady, "we need to find a way out. Now." But Joe wasn't responding. His eyes were wide with panic, his breath shallow. He was staring into the darkness, like he could feel the same thing I was feeling. Something was in here with us. The ground trembled again, but this time it wasn't a rumble. It was the sound of something massive moving beneath us, clawing its way through the earth. The noise grew louder, more violent, until the whole cavern seemed to shake. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance again as the sound came closer. And then, I saw it. A shadow, massive and distorted, loomed at the entrance of the cavern. It was moving too quickly, too smoothly for something that big. The creature was crawling, scraping itself along the rock with unnatural ease. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the meager light of my flashlight. My throat went dry, and I took a step back, unable to tear my gaze away. The thing was horrifying. Its twisted, rodent-like body was massive, twice the size of any normal rat, with skin that seemed to ripple unnaturally, shifting as if it were made of liquid. Its long, segmented tail swayed behind it, scraping the ground like a whip. And those eyes, those awful, gleaming eyes, stared right at me. Before I could react, it lunged. The sound of its claws scraping against the floor was deafening as it closed the distance between us. The others screamed, scrambling to their feet. Marco tried to climb the wall of the cavern, but he slipped, falling back onto the floor with a scream of pain. I didn't know what to do. The creature was too fast, too powerful. There was nowhere to run. But then, just as it seemed the end was near, I heard something. A voice. Move. Get to the tunnel. I turned, shocked. It was Joe. His face was pale, his eyes wide, but there was something different in his gaze, something almost desperate. Without thinking, I ran. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed myself forward, ignoring the pain in my legs, ignoring the terrifying creature behind us. I had no plan, no idea where I was going, but I knew that if I stayed still, I would die. Joe was ahead of me, Marco trailing behind, still limping. We were heading for a narrow opening in the cavern, a crack in the wall that seemed like it might lead somewhere, anywhere but here. The creature was following us. It was too close. I could feel the vibrations of its movements, hear the growls, the scratches, the terrible sound of its claws tearing through the stone. But as I neared the opening, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There was no way out. The crack in the wall was a dead end. Move! Joe screamed, but I couldn't move. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that the only way out was the same way the creature was coming from. And then I saw it. The creature's glowing eyes, just beyond the narrow gap in the wall, watching us. It was coming. Too close. There was nowhere to run anymore. I froze. And then, as if the earth itself were about to swallow us, the sound stopped. The silence was suffocating. For a brief moment, I thought the creature had retreated, but the stillness was unnatural, like the calm before a storm. My breathing was ragged, and the others were equally frozen, all eyes darting to the narrow crack in the wall, the only potential escape route that had now turned into a trap. Joe's panicked whisper cut through the tension. What the hell is going on? Why did it stop? We all stood there, unsure of what to do next. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the weight of the silence pressing down on me, suffocating. But then, that silence was shattered by a sound more terrifying than anything we had heard before, the scraping of claws against rock, but this time it was not a single sound. It was a symphony, an orchestra of movement, as if multiple creatures were closing in on us from all directions. I spun around, my eyes scanning the cavern, my breath coming in short gasps. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. I could hear their claws skittering across the floor, their breathing shallow and rapid, like they were circling us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Move. Now! Joe shouted, his voice frantic, but there was no direction, no clear plan. We were caught in the jaws of something ancient and unstoppable. I darted towards the crack in the wall, my body moving on instinct, but as I reached it, my hand met cold stone, not the promised opening I had imagined. There was no escape here. No way through. Joe! Marco screamed from behind me, and I spun just in time to see him stagger and fall. His leg, his broken leg, was preventing him from standing, and before I could react, the sound of something moving swiftly toward him echoed through the cavern. The creature. I heard a horrified scream tear from Marco's throat as something large and wet grabbed him. It wasn't a single scream, it was a chorus of screams, a maddening blend of human terror and animalistic growls. My stomach churned as I watched, helpless, as Marco was dragged away, the glow of the creature's eyes flashing in the darkness before it disappeared into the void. No! I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the cavern. It was too late. Joe, still shaking beside me, gripped my arm with a desperation I had never seen before. We need to get out of here. We need to. The ground trembled again. This time, it wasn't a vibration. It was the full weight of something massive, something that shook the walls and rattled my bones. And then, through the dark, through the chaos, I heard it, the thing that would haunt my nightmares forever. The growl. Low. Deep. Coming from the direction of the cavern's exit. It was a sound like no animal I had ever heard before, not like the skittering of rats or the growls of wild dogs. It was more like a guttural rumble, a growl that echoed through my skull, freezing me in place. And then, slowly, the darkness parted just enough for me to see it. The creature emerged from the shadows, its massive form filling the cavern. It wasn't just one of them. There were three. Their eyes gleamed like reflective pools in the night, their bodies slithering out from the walls as if they were part of the stone itself. The first one, the largest, towered over us, its body rippling with unnatural movements. It had the face of a rat, but there was something wrong about it, something wrong with the way it moved, with the way its eyes locked onto mine, cold and unblinking. And then I heard the whispers. Soft at first, like a breeze sweeping through the cavern. But then they grew louder, a chorus of voices in my head, murmuring in strange languages I couldn't understand. I could feel them inside my mind, pushing, probing, trying to break through my thoughts. I fought to hold onto my sanity, but it was like trying to hold onto water with my bare hands. The creature's eyes burned into me, and the whispers grew louder, sharper. Join us. I shook my head, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't let it take me. I couldn't let it pull me into the darkness. But no matter how much I tried to fight, I felt it, slowly, steadily, dragging me down into the black abyss. Joe, his eyes wide with panic, turned to me. We have to fight back, he shouted, his voice breaking. We can't just let them. But it was too late. The creatures were already moving in, their claws scraping against the stone floor, their bodies undulating in the shadows. I could feel them getting closer, feel the cold air around them as they closed in on us. And then, in a flash, one of them lunged forward. Its claws slashed across the ground, and I barely managed to dodge it. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but before I could react, I saw the other one coming for me. I barely had time to scream before its jaws clamped down on my leg. Pain. Fire. White-hot agony. But that wasn't what made me scream. It was the voice in my head that whispered, "You are mine now." I tried to fight it. I tried to push it away, but I could feel it, like a weight pressing against my chest, suffocating me, pulling me down into the void. I glanced at Joe, his face pale and twisted in fear. I saw the creature's shadow looming over him, heard the echo of its growl, and I knew that he was going to be next. And then, everything went black. The sun rose over the city of New York, casting its golden rays over the streets, unaware of the horrors hidden beneath them. The workers that went down into the tunnels that day were never seen again. The cracks in the walls remained, silent and unyielding. But somewhere, deep beneath the surface, in the cold, forgotten caverns of the earth, the creatures waited. And the whispers never stopped. The Forgotten Souls. Have you ever felt like something was watching you, even when you knew you were alone? That feeling that crawls under your skin, making every movement seem unnaturally loud, every shadow too deep. I had never believed in ghosts. But then again, I had never lived in the mountains either. I came to the small village of Glenshore in the heart of the Carpathian Mountains, looking for a quiet place to escape the chaos of the city. The villagers were friendly, reserved, but friendly. They welcomed me with open arms, their faces wrinkled with age, their eyes telling stories of lives lived in silence. It seemed like the perfect place to start over. The first few days were peaceful. The crisp mountain air was refreshing, and the narrow winding streets of the village felt like something out of a forgotten storybook. The evenings, though, were different. The village was quiet, too quiet. When night fell, it was as if the world itself held its breath. And that was when I first heard it. A soft rustling, like the wind stirring through the leaves, came from the woods behind my small cottage. At first, I thought nothing of it. After all, the mountains were full of life, animals, trees, the occasional traveler. But there was something off about the sound. It wasn't like the usual noise of the forest. This was a low, continuous rustling, almost like footsteps, but too deliberate, too slow. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe an animal on the hunt, or the wind playing tricks on my mind. But as the nights grew longer, the rustling grew louder, more insistent. It always started around midnight, just as the last hints of twilight disappeared and the full weight of the darkness descended. On the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the cold night, the beam cutting through the thick fog that had settled over the village. The air was damp, heavy, as if the very atmosphere was saturated with something I couldn't explain. I made my way toward the edge of the woods, where the rustling seemed to be the loudest. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but I was determined to find this source. That's why I saw it. At first, it was a shadow, a vague figure moving between the trees, far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. I froze, staring at the figure as it moved with an eerie grace, almost like it was floating rather than walking. The rustling stopped, replaced by an unnatural stillness, as if the world itself had paused to watch. I should have turned back then, should have run inside and locked the door, but some irrational part of me, kept me rooted to the spot. I needed to understand. I needed to know what this was. The figure moved again, closer this time. As it came into the light, I realized it wasn't a person at all. At least, not in the way I understood people. It was a figure made of shadow and fog, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to bend the very air around it. And its eyes were what held me in place. Glowing faintly, like the embers of a long-dead fire, they were fixed directly on me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as it drew closer, its form shifting and flickering in the dim light. The whispers started then, faint at first, like a distant murmur carried on the wind. But as the figure grew nearer, they grew louder, hissing voices, overlapping, as if thousands of voices were trapped within the same being, all whispering something I couldn't understand. Help us. The words were soft, barely audible, but they sent a chill through my spine. The figure moved toward me, its shape becoming more distinct with each step, revealing the form of a person, or at least, something that once was. The closer it got, the clearer I could see it, a man, dressed in tattered clothes that seemed to melt into the fog. His face was pale, almost translucent, as if the very light was afraid to touch him. I tried to speak, to ask who he was, what he wanted, but my voice caught in my throat, paralyzed by fear. Help us. The voice was clearer now, still a whisper, but it echoed in my mind, as if it was inside me, not just around me. I stumbled backward, but my legs didn't respond. It felt like the earth was swallowing me whole. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to obey. And that's when I saw the others. They were emerging from the fog, more figures, more shadows, each one indistinct at first, but as they came closer, their forms solidified. There were at least a dozen of them, all drifting toward me, their glowing eyes fixed in a way that was unnatural, like they were drawn to me. Their whispers filled the air, overlapping and spiraling into a cacophony of voices that tugged at the edges of my sanity. I realized then that they were not just shadows. They were souls, lost, confused, searching for something. But what? The fog thickened around me, and I could feel a pressure building in my chest, as if the air itself was being sucked away. The voices, the whispers, grew louder, more insistent. Help us. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I needed to escape, to get away from them, but there was nowhere to run. The woods were closing in, and the figures were closing in as well. They reached out toward me with hands that seemed to stretch and fade, as if they were nothing more than illusions, but their touch, when it finally came, was cold and unyielding. The last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me whole was the whispers. Always the whispers. Help us. And then, silence. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, heart still hammering in my chest. The dim morning light filtered through the small window of my cottage, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. The fog had lifted, and the village seemed peaceful again, as if nothing had happened during the night. But I knew better now. Something had changed, something I couldn't explain, and the fear that had gripped me in my dream, or was it real, clung to me like a second skin. I could still feel the coldness of those outstretched hands, the weight of their eyes on me, the whispers that had followed me into the silence of sleep. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just a nightmare, a product of too much stress, a bad night's sleep. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The village, the people here, they weren't telling me everything. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of unease that lingered even when the sun was up. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out what was going on. After breakfast, I made my way to the local tavern. The villagers gathered there every day, sharing stories and gossip over mugs of warm cider. I needed to talk to someone to find out if anyone else had experienced what I had. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had seen those shadows. Inside the tavern, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and herbs. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering light on the worn wooden tables. The regulars sat in their usual spots, their conversations hushed as I walked in. The barkeep, a large man with a thick beard and tired eyes, nodded in greeting as I approached the counter. "Coffee?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, but I wasn't sure I needed it. My nerves were already frayed enough, and the warmth of the drink only added to the tension in my chest. The barkeep poured the coffee and slid the mug across the counter to me. "You're new around here," he said, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than usual. "Most people don't come to Glenshore unless they're running from something." I raised an eyebrow, curious but cautious. "What do you mean?" He hesitated before speaking, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's talk in this village. Not everyone is as they seem. Some of us, we're bound to this place. Stuck here, even after death." I felt a chill run down my spine. This was not the answer I had been expecting. "What do you mean? Are you saying ghosts?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The barkeep's eyes flicked around the room nervously, making sure no one was listening too closely. He leaned in, lowering his voice even further. "There are things in these mountains, things that don't belong. Not just in the woods, but underground too. Some people think it's the land, cursed by something older than any of us. And the souls, they can't leave. They wander the village, the tunnels, lost, forgotten. They're trapped, and they want something. I don't know what, but it's not peace. I swallowed hard, unsure of how to process what he had said. Could it be true? Were the shadows I had seen last night something more than just a figment of my imagination? Before I could ask him anything more, the door to the tavern creaked open, and an elderly man stepped inside. His clothes were old and faded, his hunchback bent under the weight of years. His face was pale, with hollowed eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He had the air of someone who had been here longer than he should have, someone who had witnessed things best left unseen. He walked straight to the counter, ignoring everyone else in the room. The barkeep stiffened when he saw him, but said nothing. Another one, the old man rasped, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. Another fool who thinks they can run from their past. They never learn. I stared at him, unsettled by the harshness in his tone. The barkeep, sensing my curiosity, leaned in slightly. "Don't mind him," he murmured. "He's been around longer than most of us. Knows things, he's seen them." "Seen what?" I asked, though my voice was almost a whisper. I didn't want to hear the answer, but I couldn't stop myself. The old man looked up at me, his eyes narrow and unblinking. "The souls. The ones who can't leave. The ones that walk in the night. They come for you, and once they do, you won't be able to escape." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The words felt like a weight settling over my chest, squeezing out all the air around me. I felt my throat tighten, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to ask him more, to understand what he was talking about, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything else. The old man turned away without another word, disappearing into the shadows of the tavern as quickly as he had come. I sat there in stunned silence, the mug of coffee forgotten in front of me. The whispers, the shadows, the warnings, it was all too much. What was happening in this village? And what did it mean for me? I couldn't stay here. Not like this. But I also couldn't leave. Something was drawing me in, a pull I couldn't explain, and deep down, I knew that I had to find the truth, no matter the cost. I stood up, my mind made up. It was time to find out what was really happening in these mountains. But as I walked out into the street, the rustling began again, soft, insistent, like footsteps in the distance. And I knew, deep in my bones, that it was not just a dream. It was real. And it was coming for me. The morning had passed, but the chill of fear clung to me like a second skin. The whispers I had heard, the warnings from the old man, and the strange feelings that seemed to weigh down every breath, everything felt wrong. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something in this village wasn't right, and I was getting too close to uncovering it. I left the tavern, walking down the narrow streets of Glenshore. The village, once familiar and comforting, now seemed oppressive, as if the very air held secrets it didn't want to reveal. The houses, the trees, even the sky overhead, it all felt like it was watching me. The echoes of my footsteps on the cobblestone road were the only sound that broke the uneasy silence. I had no real destination in mind, just a need to understand, to find answers. As I walked, I passed the small cemetery at the edge of the village. The iron gate creaked in the wind, and for a moment, I felt an almost magnetic pull toward it. Something whispered in the back of my mind, urging me to enter. I hesitated. The cemetery had always been a place of quiet reverence in the village, but today it seemed different. The air was thick, as though it had absorbed the sorrow of generations past. A soft breeze stirred the dry leaves scattered across the ground, but there was no comfort in it. It felt like the wind itself was sighing in grief. I stepped inside, the gravel path crunching underfoot. The gravestones were old, withered by time and the elements, many of them barely legible. A few were fresh, the soil still disturbed, but most were forgotten. The village had long since moved on, and the dead here were left to linger in the shadows, their names lost to time. I walked between the rows of gravestones, my eyes scanning the names as I went. Each one felt like a silent accusation, a reminder of the forgotten lives. I didn't know why, but I had to keep moving, had to find something. There was something about this place, about the earth beneath my feet, that pulled me deeper. As I reached the farthest corner of the cemetery, I noticed a small, neglected stone, half buried beneath a tangle of ivy. I knelt down to clear away the overgrowth, revealing the inscription. The letters were faint, but I could just make them out. Evelyn Gray, died, 1889. May her soul find peace. The name struck a chord within me, though I couldn't place why. Evelyn Gray, something about it felt familiar, but I couldn't quite grasp it. A memory, a shadow in my mind, teasing me. I was about to stand up when I heard it. A sound, faint at first, but unmistakable, a soft whisper, as if someone was speaking just behind me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment everything felt still, as though the world had stopped turning. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It was not words, not exactly, but a call. A name. My name. Sarah. I spun around, my pulse racing, but the cemetery was empty. No one was there. I was alone. But that didn't stop the chill that spread through my body, nor the heavy weight pressing down on my chest. It was as if the very air had thickened, thick with the presence of something unseen, something close. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the uneven ground as I rushed to leave the cemetery. My breath came in shallow gasps, the whispers still echoing in my ears, as though they were trying to reach me from beyond the grave. Sarah. I turned back just as I was about to reach the gate, and for a split second, I saw something, just a flicker in the corner of my eye. A shadow, tall and thin, standing between the graves. My heart stopped in my chest. It wasn't human. The shape twisted unnaturally, its form barely visible, but I could feel its presence as surely as if it were standing right in front of me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadow didn't move either, it just stood there, watching me. Leave. The whisper came again, but this time it was more forceful, a command. Leave now, or you will join them. I stumbled backward, my body moving before my mind could catch up. I rushed out of the cemetery, my legs shaking, and didn't stop until I was safely back in the village, the sounds of the whispering wind fading behind me. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion. The grave, the whisper, the shadow, none of it made sense. I tried to rationalize it, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. It was real. Something was pulling me into this mystery, something I couldn't explain. And it wasn't going to let me go until I discovered the truth. As I walked through the village square, I spotted a familiar face. The young woman I had seen earlier that morning, the one who had greeted me with such a sad smile. She stood at the edge of the square, her hands wringing nervously in front of her. Her eyes were wide, and she was staring at me as if she had seen a ghost. Before I could approach her, She turned quickly and disappeared into one of the narrow alleys. I hesitated for a moment, then followed. Something told me she knew more than she was letting on, and I needed to know what she had seen. The alley was narrow and dimly lit, the walls of the houses pressing in on both sides. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing off the cobblestones, trying to catch up. She was just ahead, her silhouette faint in the distance. Then, I heard it again. The whisper. Not from behind me this time, but from ahead. A voice I recognized, her voice. You shouldn't be here. None of you should. I froze, my body trembling. This wasn't a warning. It was a plea. I rounded the corner just in time to see the woman step into the shadows. The alley ahead was now empty, but I could feel her presence, lingering. And I knew, without a doubt, that I was getting closer to the truth. But at what cost? I didn't know if I was ready to face whatever waited in the dark, but I had no choice. I was already too deep, and the forgotten souls of Glenshore were calling for me. I stood frozen in the alley, the woman's voice still ringing in my ears. None of us should be here. I repeated those words over and over in my mind, as if trying to extract some meaning from them, something that would make sense of the nightmare I was slowly stepping into. The air around me felt heavy, as if it were suffocating under the weight of secrets long buried. I turned the corner, but the woman was gone. The alley stretched before me, seemingly endless and dark, the shadows swallowing any trace of her. My heart pounded in my chest as I hurried forward, but the narrow path seemed to narrow even more, pushing me toward an unseen edge. It was as though the village itself was closing in around me. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faintest sounds, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant creak of old wood, the almost imperceptible sound of something shifting in the darkness. Every step I took felt like it echoed through the streets, and the further I went, the more uneasy I became. The village, once so familiar, now seemed alien, as though I were walking through a distorted version of it. Each house, each corner, seemed to warp and stretch before my eyes, as if they, too, were haunted by something I couldn't see. I didn't know how much longer I could take it. I had to find answers. I had to confront whatever this was, whatever they were. The lost souls, the shadows, the whispers that never seemed to fade. There was something beneath the surface, something that had been hidden for far too long. And somehow, I had become part of it. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye, barely visible in the periphery, a flicker of a figure, like a shadow crossing the street ahead. I froze. There was no sound. No footsteps. Only the sense that something, or someone, was watching. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The old woman's warning flashed through my mind. You shouldn't be here. But the words felt like they came from somewhere far away now, swallowed by the terror that had taken root in my chest. The shadow in front of me moved again. This time, I could see it more clearly, but only for a moment, a tall, thin figure, its outline fading and blending into the darkness around it. It was almost as if it wasn't fully real, not entirely here, not entirely anywhere. Just a fragment of something that didn't belong. I could feel my legs move before my mind had caught up. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to follow it. I needed answers, or at least, I needed to know that I wasn't losing my mind. This place, this village, was alive with something dark, something ancient, and it was calling me, pulling me toward it. I rounded another corner and found myself at the edge of a small courtyard. In the center stood a well, the stone walls crumbling with age, but it was the faint glow from inside that caught my attention. It was a soft light, almost ethereal, like the shimmer of moonlight on water, but there was something unsettling about it. Something wrong. I moved closer, my eyes fixed on the glow. And then I saw it, reflected in the surface of the water, a face. My heart stopped, and my breath hitched in my throat. It was me. But it wasn't me, not exactly. The face in the water was distorted, the features twisted in a way that I couldn't comprehend. It was as though the reflection was not of me at all, but of someone else, someone who had been here before, someone who had looked into this very well and never left. I stumbled back, my hands shaking. "What is this?" I whispered, but the words seemed to get lost in the air. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. The well's stone edge crumbled, and I found myself slipping toward the opening. I gasped and reached out, my fingers grazing the edge of the stone as I tried to catch myself, but it was too late. My hands slid off, and I fell. I hit the water with a splash, the cold shock of it surging through me. The surface was dark, too dark to see anything beneath, but I knew I had to get out. The current was pulling at me, dragging me further into the well, deeper into the unknown. I kicked, trying to swim, but the water seemed to pull me down, not letting me go. The whispers returned, louder now, all around me. "Sarah. Sarah." The water swirled around me, tugging at my limbs, pulling me further down. My chest tightened with panic as I gasped for air. I couldn't breathe. The whispers were deafening now, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. I was drowning, not just in the water, but in the weight of all the voices, all the souls that had never found peace. And then, just as I felt I could go no further, a hand gripped my wrist. I didn't know if it was real. I didn't know if it was human. All I knew was that it was strong, and it pulled me upward, out of the darkness. The surface broke, and I gasped for air, my body shuddering with relief. I was no longer in the well. I was on solid ground, my body soaking wet, but the grip on my wrist hadn't loosened. I looked up. It was her, the woman I had seen earlier, the one who had warned me. But she wasn't just a woman anymore. Her eyes, wide and desperate, glowed faintly in the dark. Her face was pale, as though the life had been drained from it, and her mouth moved, whispering something I couldn't hear. But it didn't matter. I could feel her terror, her urgency, as she pulled me toward the edge of the courtyard, away from the well. "You have to leave. You have to leave now, before it's too late." Her voice was barely a whisper, but the fear in it was clear. I didn't ask her to explain. I didn't ask how she knew. I just let her pull me forward, away from the well, away from the darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. As we moved through the village, the whispers faded. The shadows, once lurking in every corner, began to recede. But I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The truth was still out there, waiting for me. And somehow, I was bound to it. The forgotten souls, the ones who were trapped, their whispers lingering in the air, would not let me go. They were part of me now. And I had no idea how much further I would have to go to uncover the truth. But one thing was certain, I couldn't stop now. Not when I had seen the darkness with my own eyes. The woman dragged me through the village with frantic urgency, her grip tight and insistent. The cold, damp air clung to my skin, but it wasn't the chill that made me shiver. It was the sense that something was wrong, something I couldn't see but could feel in every bone. The shadows that had once seemed distant now loomed closer, pressing in from all sides, and the silence between us felt suffocating. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, words trapped beneath the weight of everything I had just experienced. The well, the figure, the strange woman, nothing made sense. The village had changed. It wasn't the place I had once known. Now, it felt as though it was alive, a breathing thing, and I was its prey. "Where are you taking me?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. The woman didn't answer at first. She kept her head down, her pace quickening as we moved deeper into the village. Her eyes darted back and forth, as if she expected something to leap out from the darkness at any moment. The moonlight above cast long, eerie shadows, and I could almost swear that the buildings around us were watching, their windows like empty eyes. "Please," I begged, trying to keep up with her hurried steps. "I don't understand. What is happening here?" She stopped abruptly and turned to face me. Her eyes were wild now, the glow dimming but still visible, like fading embers. "You have to understand, Sarah," she said, her voice shaking. "This village, this place, it's not what you think. We're all stuck here, bound by something ancient. Something that's been watching us, waiting." The words hit me like a cold slap. "Stuck here?" I echoed, my voice trembling. "What do you mean? Who are you?" She hesitated, as though trying to decide whether or not to reveal the truth. Then she spoke, her voice barely audible. "I'm one of them, Sarah. A soul caught between worlds. I was like you once. I didn't understand either." She looked down, as if ashamed. "I thought it was just a dream, a nightmare. But it's real. And it's been going on for as long as anyone can remember." A wave of cold dread washed over me. I wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The village felt like a trap, its streets leading only deeper into darkness. The woman's words echoed in my mind, twisting and turning. A soul caught between worlds. Was that what I was now? Had I already crossed a line, stepped into a place where time didn't exist, where reality bent and fractured? Why me? I whispered, staring at her with a mix of confusion and fear. "Why did you choose me?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, her gaze sharp, scanning the darkened alleyways. "I didn't choose you, Sarah," she said, her voice strained. "It's not about choice. It's about fate. And the curse that ties us all to this place." The words hung in the air between us, thick with the weight of the unknown. The woman turned quickly and began to walk again, her pace faster now. "Come on, we don't have much time." I followed, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of everything. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't in control anymore. I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no waking up. The village, the souls, the darkness, they were all part of something bigger than I could comprehend. As we walked, I noticed a strange, faint glow coming from the end of the street. It was different from the moonlight or the distant lanterns. This light was eerie, unnatural, pulsing with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My feet seemed to move faster, drawn toward it despite my fear. The woman's hand tightened around my wrist as she quickened her pace. "We have to reach the clearing," she urged, "before they find us." "Who?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Who will find us?" But she didn't answer. Instead, she tugged me forward, guiding me through the winding streets toward the glowing light. The air grew colder the closer we got, and the shadows seemed to shift and move around us. I felt eyes on me, watching, waiting for something. We reached the clearing, a small, desolate space at the edge of the village. The light, now brighter and more defined, seemed to pulse from the ground itself, casting an otherworldly glow on the dry earth beneath us. It wasn't just light, it was energy, an unsettling, humming force that vibrated in the air. The woman stopped, turning to face me with wide, desperate eyes. "This is where it all begins," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The heart of the curse. The source of everything." I looked down at the ground, my stomach churning with dread. The earth beneath my feet seemed to shift, the ground rumbling faintly, as if it were alive, reacting to our presence. Suddenly, I heard it, a sound that froze me in place. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling, like the wind blowing through dry leaves. But then it grew louder. It wasn't just wind. It was footsteps, dragging across the ground, heavy and deliberate. The woman gasped, her eyes widening in horror. "They've found us," she whispered. I turned to look behind us, but the street was empty. There was no one there. Yet, the footsteps grew louder, closer, as if someone, was coming toward us from the darkness. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. I was paralyzed by the fear of what I might see. The air grew thick with tension, and the hum of the light in the clearing intensified. The footsteps stopped abruptly. I could feel the presence before I saw anything, something, or someone, watching us from the shadows. My heart raced in my chest, and the silence became unbearable. "Sarah," the woman said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's time. You have to face it now. The truth." Before I could react, a figure stepped into the clearing. It was tall and cloaked in darkness, its features hidden beneath a hood. But there was no mistaking the presence. It was something ancient, something powerful, and it was the source of everything. "Sarah," the figure said, its voice low and chilling. "You should never have come here." The woman beside me let out a strangled cry, her body trembling. No, not you," she whispered, her face pale as if she had seen a ghost. She stepped back, her eyes wide with terror. The figure reached out, its hand a dark blur in the light. I felt the coldness of its touch even before it made contact. The ground trembled beneath us, and everything around me seemed to collapse into darkness. The last thing I heard was the woman's scream, and then everything went black. I had no idea what would happen next. I only knew one thing for certain: I was no longer alone in the village. Whatever had been waiting for me had found me. The Old Town Court. It was a quiet morning when I first noticed the Old Town Courthouse. The kind of morning where the sun barely touched the horizon and a heavy mist hung low, shrouding the small Indiana town in an eerie blanket. I had just moved to this place, a new start after the whirlwind of a broken life. The small town seemed like the perfect escape from the chaos I had left behind. But something about the courthouse felt off. Its large, looming stone walls and crooked clock tower seemed out of place, like it had been there for centuries, standing as a silent witness to things better forgotten. I had heard the rumors, of course, the strange happenings, the unexplained illnesses, the disappearances, but I had chalked them up to local superstition. Small towns have a way of holding onto their myths, especially when the past is as dark as this one. I worked at the small diner on Main Street, the kind where everyone knew everyone's name, and you could hear the gossip over coffee at dawn. That morning, as I wiped down the counter, a few regulars were discussing the courthouse and how it had been closed for repairs for the past few months. Repairs, they said, but the way they spoke made it clear they didn't believe the story. People just stopped going there. One of them, an older man named Jim, said, his voice low and careful. Can't trust a place that's been around as long as that one. You'd be surprised at what it hides. Another woman, Martha, chimed in, folks say the judges there aren't real judges anymore. Some folks say they're not even human. She laughed nervously, but I could hear the edge in her voice. My curiosity piqued. I decided to visit the courthouse later that day. I had nothing to lose and everything to learn. I was drawn to it, as if it had been calling me from the moment I arrived in town. The courthouse was only a few blocks away from the diner. The streets, still empty at that time of day, led me straight to its iron gate. The closer I got, the more oppressive the air felt. The gate itself was rusted, its edges jagged, and it creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The path leading to the courthouse door was lined with dead trees, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for the sky. Everything seemed frozen in time, as if the building had absorbed decades of secrets. I stepped inside. The doors groaned as they opened, revealing a darkened hallway that stretched endlessly. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the soft scuff of my shoes against the floor. The walls were lined with old portraits of stern-faced men and women, their eyes following me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. A faint scent of must and decay filled the air, as if the building itself had been abandoned for years, though it was clear that the court still operated on occasion. I wandered deeper into the building, my steps hesitant. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, answers, perhaps, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The sound of my own breathing felt too loud in the silence, and every shadow seemed to hold something just out of sight. When I reached the courtroom, I found it eerily quiet. The rows of seats were empty, save for a single figure at the judge's bench. A man in a dark robe sat motionless, his back to me. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I called softly, unsure if I was speaking to myself or to the figure at the bench. There was no response. The air in the room grew colder, and I shivered, my skin tingling with the sensation of being utterly alone, except I knew I wasn't. A noise interrupted my thoughts, footsteps, soft at first, then growing louder. My eyes flicked toward the door, but no one entered. Instead, a chill swept through the room, as if something unseen had brushed past me. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The judge's chair was empty. I rushed out of the room, my heart racing. I needed to leave, but something compelled me to take one last look. I turned back just in time to see the door slammed shut behind me, and the entire building seemed to exhale, the walls groaning as if something had been released. As I left the courthouse, my mind raced. What had I seen? Who had been in that chair? And why did it feel as though the building itself was alive, watching me? But it was too late. The courthouse had already begun its pull. The stories were true. Something about the place was wrong, and I was now a part of it. And in the days that followed, I would learn just how far the darkness of the courthouse stretched, how it wasn't only the building that was cursed, but the people who entered it, the souls that had been condemned by its unseen hand. And how, once you entered, there was no escape. The old courthouse would claim me, just as it had claimed others before me. I could feel it in my bones, a creeping, suffocating certainty. I couldn't explain why, but the courthouse was waiting for something to happen again. It had been waiting for me. The next few days passed in a haze. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even while I was miles away from the courthouse. It wasn't just the townspeople anymore. The building itself had taken residence in my thoughts, and it clung to my mind with an unshakable grip. I would catch myself staring at the clock on my wall, imagining it as the one from the courthouse. Or I would hear a creak in the floorboards of my apartment, and my heart would race, wondering if it was a sound from the long-forgotten halls of the court. I tried to ignore the nagging feeling, the way the shadows in my apartment seemed to stretch a little longer each day. But then, one evening, as I was walking home from the diner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was just before dusk, when the sky was streaked with deep shades of purple and orange. I was halfway down the street when I noticed a figure standing at the iron gates of the courthouse. My first instinct was to ignore it, to keep walking and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But something made me stop. The figure was tall, draped in a long coat that hid its features, standing perfectly still in the fading light. The street was empty, no one else was around. As I watched, the figure turned slowly toward me, and for a moment, I thought I saw its face. But it wasn't a face at all, just a black void where eyes should have been. My breath caught in my throat. Before I could move, the figure vanished into the mist that had begun to roll in from the fields. It was as though it had been swallowed by the very air itself. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew in that moment that something inside the courthouse had seen me. I had been marked. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of the light, some sort of hallucination brought on by stress. But even as I walked past the courthouse on my way to the diner, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. It was as if the air around the building was thicker, more suffocating. I could hear a faint scraping sound coming from the inside, a sound so faint it might have been the wind, but it didn't sound like wind. Later that day, I received a call at the diner. The voice on the other end was familiar. It was Jim, the old man who had warned me about the courthouse. His voice was shaky, as though he had just run a marathon. "You need to stay away from there," he gasped, his voice cracking. "The courthouse it's not what it seems. It's been awake for too long. I can feel it coming for me. You need to leave before it's too late." Before I could respond, the line went dead. The next few days were a blur of unsettling dreams and paranoid thoughts. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like a threat. I started to feel like the courthouse was alive, watching me through every window, every mirror. Even in my sleep, I saw its shadow creeping around my apartment. I couldn't escape it. The closer I got to the courthouse, the more I heard the whispers, quiet at first, barely audible, but growing louder the closer I got to the building. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, 1,000 voices speaking in unison. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning, a demand. The whispers were louder now. The closer I came, the more urgent they became. Something was pulling me back, and I was too weak to resist. I couldn't remember how many times I had visited the courthouse in the past few days. It felt like my steps had taken on a life of their own. I had tried to stay away, but each time I walked by, the door seemed to call to me, and my body betrayed me, leading me back to the oppressive darkness inside. The last time I entered, the doors swung open with a force that startled me. I had expected the building to be as it always was, silent, desolate, and still. But instead, I was greeted by an unsettling sight. The courtroom was full, but it wasn't filled with people. There were no witnesses or defendants sitting in their seats. Instead, there were shadows, black, shapeless forms slowly gathering in the seats as though the room itself was absorbing them. They weren't human, not even close. They were something else entirely. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to be coming from every direction, curling around my ears, wrapping around my mind. The figures in the courtroom didn't move, but I felt them watching me. And then, as if from nowhere, a figure appeared in front of the judge's bench. It wasn't the man I had seen before. This figure was different, its features blurred and shifting, like a shadow in the dark. "Welcome," the voice was deep, guttural, and echoed off the walls. It wasn't a voice I could understand, but somehow, I knew what it meant. "You've come for judgment." The room spun. I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't breathe. The floor beneath my feet began to tremble, as if the building itself was waking from a long, cursed sleep. Something was wrong. Everything was wrong. And then, without warning, I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, two cold, unblinking eyes, stared at me from the corner of the room. They were watching me, and for a moment, I could hear nothing but the sound of my own frantic breath. The courthouse had found me. It was alive. And it wasn't going to let me leave. The room seemed to close in around me. The shadows began to shift and move, swirling like smoke in a tempest as the glowing eyes intensified. I could feel them on me, boring into my very soul. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices that whispered in a language I could not comprehend, but the weight of their intent was clear. I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the air thick and heavy with an oppressive presence. My legs trembled beneath me, and for a split second, I thought I might collapse. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, my feet rooted to the floor by an unseen force. The figure at the judge's bench, if it could be called a figure, loomed larger, its shape flickering like a flame in the wind, never fully forming. It spoke again, its voice sending a chill down my spine. "You think you can escape?" The words echoed, but the voice itself was impossible to place. It came from everywhere at once, surrounding me, sinking into my mind. "You think you can simply walk away?" I tried to speak, to explain, but my throat was dry, and no words came out. My body refused to obey my commands, as though it too had become part of the courthouse's twisted will. The floor beneath me groaned, the building itself seeming to breathe, exhaling in long, deep shudders. I had to get out. I had to leave. But my body refused to move. The doors behind me slammed shut with a resounding thud, and the sounds of the outside world, once comforting, familiar, faded into an eerie silence. And then I felt it. A cold draft slid across my skin, as though something icy and intangible was brushing against me. It was the feeling of something crawling just out of sight, something that I could feel but not see. My heart raced, my thoughts became erratic. I tried to focus, tried to think logically. Maybe this was just a nightmare. Maybe I was hallucinating. But as the shadows moved, as the air thickened with every breath, I knew I was far beyond the realm of reason. One of the figures in the courtroom shifted. It didn't rise, didn't move in any way that was natural for a human. Instead, it seemed to glide, its shape flickering like the flames of a dying fire. It came closer, and as it did, the whispers grew louder. I could hear them more clearly now. "Guilty. Guilty. Guilty." Each word was like a blade, cutting through my thoughts, my memories. The words burrowed into my mind, like parasites, taking root and spreading. My vision blurred as I tried to shake off the sensation. I wasn't guilty. I hadn't done anything wrong. I had just walked into this place out of curiosity, out of the need to understand. But they didn't care about that. The courthouse didn't care about the truth. The figure that had been slowly approaching me now stopped just inches from my face. It was formless, an ever-shifting mass of darkness, but I could feel its presence, its weight pressing against me, choking the air from my lungs. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, gleamed like embers in a fire, cold and merciless. "You are guilty," the voice whispered again, a low, guttural hiss that reverberated through my bones. "Your sin is your curiosity. And now, you will be judged." The ground beneath me trembled violently, and the entire building seemed to groan in protest. I could feel the weight of the courthouse, its age, its history, all pressing down on me. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing around me until there was nothing but darkness. The doors. I had to get to the doors. I'd forced myself to move, to take a step, and then another. The floor was slick with something cold and wet, but I couldn't stop now. I wasn't sure if I was running from something that would kill me, or if I was running from something that already had. My body ached with each step, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. I could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow at first, but growing louder. Someone, or something, was following me. The eyes were there again, flickering in the darkness. They were everywhere now, in the shadows, in the corners of the room. They blinked in unison, and I could feel them drawing closer, relentless in their pursuit. I reached the door. It was locked. Of course, it was locked. I fumbled for the key I knew wasn't there, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I screamed, pounded on the door, but it was as though no one could hear me. My mind raced. I was running out of time. They were almost here. And then, as if the building had decided it had had enough of my resistance, the air shifted once more. The floor beneath me cracked open, and a voice, no, 1,000 voices, screamed at once, so loud and so horrible that my ears bled, my eyes burned, and my mind cracked open. The darkness consumed me. The next thing I remember, I was lying in the middle of the courtroom, sprawled on the cold, hard floor. The whispers had stopped. The eyes had faded. The shadows no longer moved. But I knew, deep in my bones, that I had never left. I was still here. Still in the courthouse. I hadn't escaped. And now, I never would. The courthouse had claimed me. And it was hungry for more. I woke with a start, the heavy air of the courtroom pressing down on me like a weight. My body ached, as though I had been crushed under the very foundation of the building. The floor beneath me was cold and damp, and for a moment, I wondered if I had been dreaming. But as I struggled to sit up, I realized with a sudden, gnawing fear that everything around me was painfully real. I wasn't alone. The courtroom stretched out before me, dimly lit by flickering, unnatural lights. The shadows no longer merely flickered, they moved, twisted in ways that no ordinary shadow should. The windows were gone, replaced by dark voids that seemed to breathe with the walls. The air was thick with a kind of oppressive silence, a silence that felt alive, as though the building itself was waiting for something to happen. And then, the whispers began again. They were quieter now, almost like a distant murmur. But they were there, slithering through the corners of my mind, the voices of the damned. I tried to shut them out, to focus on anything else, but they were insistent. They wouldn't let me be. The fear crept back into my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I needed to understand. I needed to know why I was here. My head swam with confusion. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to stand. The walls seemed to stretch higher and higher, growing impossibly tall until they seemed to vanish into the blackness above. The courtroom that had once felt like a place of order now felt like a tomb. A place of judgment. A place of damnation. The whispers grew louder, and now I could almost hear them clearly, speaking in a language I could not comprehend. But the tone, the intent, was unmistakable. It was a call, a summons. And it was directed at me. I stumbled forward, driven by instinct I didn't understand. I had to find a way out. There had to be a way out. As I moved, my eyes fell on the judge's bench. The figure that had stood there earlier, if it could even be called a figure, was gone. But in its place was something worse. A shape, dark and shifting, coiled at the base of the bench, like some terrible thing waiting to rise. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drew nearer, the air grew colder, and I could feel the very ground beneath me beginning to tremble. It was as if the building itself was alive, thrumming with malevolent energy. The shadow at the bench seemed to pulse, undulating with the rhythm of the courthouse, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. A voice cut through the air, louder than any of the whispers, a voice that resonated deep within my bones. It was not the same voice as before, but something far more ancient, more terrifying. You have been judged. You are guilty. The words echoed through me, shaking me to my core. My knees buckled beneath me, and I fell to the floor, my hands trembling as I pressed them against the cold, unforgiving stone. I could feel the weight of those words, like chains wrapping around my chest, squeezing the life out of me. I had known this moment would come, but I hadn't believed it. I had hoped that somehow, by some miracle, I could escape. But there was no escape. The judgment had already been passed. I looked up, and there it was. The figure I had seen earlier, now fully formed. A mass of darkness, a shadow that towered over me, its eyes burning like molten fire. It reached out a hand, not to help, but to pull me into the abyss. I tried to scream, to beg for mercy, but the words caught in my throat. There was nothing left but the cold grip of the shadow, pulling me deeper into the courtroom, deeper into the darkness that had claimed this place. And then, as my mind began to unravel, I heard the faintest of sounds, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps echoing through the vast emptiness of the courthouse. Someone was coming. I wasn't alone. But it was too late. I could feel the shadow swallowing me whole, pulling me into its depths. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the face of the figure that had once been the judge, now staring down at me with cold, empty eyes. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. I woke again, though I wasn't sure if I had ever truly lost consciousness. The world around me was a blur of black and gray, shapes shifting and contorting in ways that felt unnatural. I could hear the distant sound of dripping water echoing in the empty space around me. It was the sound of time passing, of the decay that seemed to consume everything. I was no longer in the courtroom. I wasn't anywhere familiar, yet everything felt eerily the same. The walls were cracked and crumbling, and the floor beneath me was cold and damp, but there was something more, something worse. The shadows had grown, twisting into grotesque forms that watched me from every corner. They didn't move, not at first, but their eyes, those horrible, gleaming eyes, followed my every movement. I could feel them on my skin, crawling beneath it, burrowing deep into my soul. I forced myself to stand. The trembling in my limbs refused to subside, and the darkness around me seemed to grow heavier with each step. My breath came in ragged gasps as I looked around, desperate for any sign of escape. But the space stretched endlessly in every direction, an unending void of misery and dread. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the air, so sudden and sharp that it made me flinch. I froze, looking around for the source of the sound. "You still think you can run?" a voice whispered from the shadows. It was the same voice from before, but now it was not alone. It was joined by others, whispers, murmurs, growls, all weaving together in a chorus of malevolence. "You've already been judged," the voice continued, louder this time. "And you have been found wanting." I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest as the realization hit me. This wasn't just a nightmare. It was real. Everything that had happened, the courtroom, the shadows, the voices, had been building to this moment. I had thought I was trying to escape, but there was no escaping this place. There was no running. The judgment was not merely a trial of the body, but of the soul. And I had failed. The walls around me groaned, shifting as if they were alive. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, of something ancient and foul. The ground beneath me trembled, and for a moment I feared the entire structure would collapse and swallow me whole. But then, something more terrifying happened. The shadows moved. Slowly at first, as though testing the waters, but then with increasing speed. They slithered across the floor, up the walls, over the ceiling, surrounding me in an impenetrable cloak of darkness. I could hear them whispering, their voices growing louder, more frantic. "Guilty. Guilty." The word echoed around me, filling every corner of the room. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was no escape. The shadows were everywhere, pressing on me from all sides. I was trapped. There was nowhere left to go. And then, through the suffocating darkness, a figure stepped forward. It was not human. It wasn't anything I could have imagined, but it was there, towering over me, a monstrous being made of darkness and shifting shapes. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, burning with a fierce, merciless fire. And its presence, it was suffocating, overwhelming, like being trapped in the gaze of some ancient, all-powerful creature. "You are not the first to face judgment here," the figure intoned. Its voice was cold, devoid of emotion, but somehow it carried the weight of centuries of suffering. "Nor will you be the last. This place claims those who are judged unworthy. And you are unworthy." I could feel the despair closing in on me, the crushing weight of its words sinking deep into my chest. My knees buckled, and I fell to the cold floor, unable to move, unable to breathe. "The price of judgment has already been paid," the figure continued. "Now you will join those who have come before you. Those who have been consumed by their own guilt." I wanted to cry out, to beg for mercy, but I couldn't. My voice was gone, lost in the crushing silence that surrounded me. The shadows were closing in again, and I could feel them pulling at me, dragging me into the depths of the darkness. And then, just as I thought I could bear it no longer, the figure spoke once more. "But there is one final choice," it said, its voice now almost curious. "You may stay here, with your guilt, your judgment, your torment. Or you may leave. Leave this place, and carry with you the knowledge of what you have done. The knowledge of what you have become." The shadows paused, waiting, as though anticipating my decision. I couldn't see the way out, couldn't see any path that would lead me away from this place. But then the figure moved, its shape distorting, as if offering me a glimpse of something, an opening, a way out. But that wasn't freedom, was it? It wasn't the escape I longed for. It was just another illusion, another layer of judgment wrapped in a different form. And so, I made my choice. I stepped forward. And as I did, I could feel myself breaking apart. The darkness was no longer just around me, it was within me, consuming me from the inside out. My body, my soul, my very being, all of it was falling into the abyss. And I realized, too late, that there was no escape from what I had become. There was only the judgment. The last call. The underground tunnels of New York City were not a place most people would venture into willingly. But for me, it was just another day on the job. I was part of the team sent to maintain the aging infrastructure beneath the city, pipes, cables, and sometimes the forgotten remnants of the past. It was dirty, exhausting work, but it paid the bills. It was late afternoon when I first heard it, a faint noise that seemed to come from deeper within the maze of tunnels. At first, I thought it was the usual creaks and groans of the old pipes, or maybe even the sound of water trickling somewhere unseen. But then it came again. A soft scratching, like something moving in the shadows. I paused, straining my ears to listen. Nothing. Just the hum of the city far above, distant and muffled. I chalked it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. It wasn't the first time the oppressive silence of the tunnels had gotten to me, making the most innocent sounds seem unsettling. "Hey, Phil," I called to my coworker, "you hear that?" Phil was hunched over by the pipes, his back to me. He didn't respond at first. The faint scratching continued, and I felt a chill creep down my spine. Something was wrong. I took a few steps toward Phil, but he still didn't react. That's when I noticed it. The air seemed heavier here, like something was wrong with it. I took a deep breath, the stale air burning in my lungs. And then I heard it again, a loud skittering sound, followed by a strange, deep echo that resonated from further down the tunnel. "Phil!" I shouted, this time with urgency. He turned slowly, his face pale in the dim light. There was a strange look in his eyes, a kind of blank fear that I couldn't place. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice now shaking. The scratching had stopped, but a heavy silence lingered in its wake. "Yeah," Phil muttered, barely audible. "But it's nothing. Just rats, probably." I tried to laugh it off, but my stomach tightened. I'd worked in these tunnels for years, and I knew rats. But this was different. This felt wrong, like we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Let's just finish up here and get out," I suggested, my voice now more hesitant than I wanted to admit. But Phil didn't move. His eyes were fixed on something deeper in the tunnel. A flicker of movement, a shadow, passed just out of reach of the light. That's when the first scream came. It was a horrible, guttural sound echoing down the tunnel with such force that it rattled my teeth. It wasn't human, and it wasn't a rat either. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed Phil by the arm. "Get up. Let's go," I yelled, dragging him toward the ladder. But he resisted, staring down the tunnel, his face a mask of terror. I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's coming." I turned to look. The shadow moved again, this time, closer. It wasn't just a flicker of light. It was something massive, too large to be a rat, and its eyes, those eyes, glowed, reflecting the dim light in a way that sent an icy jolt through my veins. I didn't wait to see more. I pulled Phil up the ladder, nearly throwing him toward the exit. We stumbled through the twisting corridors, the sound of something large skittering behind us, gaining on us with terrifying speed. "Come on!" I shouted, but Phil didn't respond. His feet were dragging, his eyes still fixed on the darkness, on whatever was chasing us. By the time we reached the stairs that led to the surface, the noises had stopped. The silence was deafening, but my heart still raced. I looked over at Phil, but he was shaking, his lips barely moving as he muttered to himself. It wasn't until we were outside, breathing in the cold, fresh air, that I realized he wasn't the same. Something in his eyes had changed. He wasn't just scared. He was broken. "What did we see down there?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He just kept looking at the ground, as though whatever was chasing us had followed him out. I could feel it too, the weight of the darkness, the unseen thing that now hung over us. I should have gone back. I should have gotten help. But I didn't. I was too afraid. We weren't alone anymore. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavier than usual, as though the city itself was holding its breath. I hadn't slept much the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes in the dark, staring back at me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Phil didn't show up to work that morning. It wasn't like him to miss a shift, especially not after what we'd seen. I told myself it was just the stress, the shock of what happened down in the tunnels. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I had to go back. The thought gnawed at me, but I couldn't ignore the pull. Something was calling me back to the tunnels, something I couldn't explain. The shadows in the corners of my mind kept growing darker, whispering that I hadn't seen the full picture, that what we encountered wasn't the only thing lurking beneath the city. I stood outside the entrance to the tunnel shaft, the heavy iron door groaning as I pushed it open. The air inside was damp, thick with the smell of rust and decay. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, the beam cutting through the suffocating darkness. The sounds of the city above were muffled now, replaced by the eerie silence of the underground. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. No one else had been down here since the incident. The company sent some people to check, but they only made it to the first few tunnels before turning back. Whatever had been chasing us, they couldn't find it. They didn't know how close it was. I hesitated, but then I heard it. The faintest of sounds, a scratch, a soft scrape, like claws on metal. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. It was the same sound I had heard the day before, but now it was closer, much closer. I took a step forward, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. What were we dealing with? Why had those things been after us? What did they want? I walked cautiously, my flashlight beam dancing across the walls of the tunnel, but the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, growing longer as I moved. I stopped when I saw it, the first sign of the creatures that haunted this place. Scattered across the floor were scraps of torn cables and chewed up pieces of wood. The stench of something rotten filled the air. And then I saw the tracks. At first, I thought they were just the usual marks left behind by rats. But these were different, too large, too wide. The prints were deep, the ground gouged by something heavy. I crouched down, running my fingers along one of the tracks. It was sticky, slick with something I couldn't identify. My stomach churned as the realization hit me. These weren't just rats. These were something else. I heard the sound again, closer this time. And this time, it wasn't just a scrape, it was the unmistakable sound of something large moving quickly, its footsteps heavy, deliberate. I spun around, heart pounding. The tunnel stretched out in front of me, dark and uninviting, but now it felt like a maze, a place I didn't belong. And then I saw it. A shadow, just at the edge of my flashlight's reach. It was tall, too tall for anything I had ever seen down here. Its outline was almost human, but distorted, its limbs too long, its shape too unnatural. The eyes reflected the light like twin orbs of fire, glowing faintly, watching me. I froze. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted back to the surface. But I didn't. I couldn't. My body felt rooted to the spot, like the shadow was pulling me in. Then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it slithered closer, its figure becoming clearer with each step. The walls of the tunnel seemed to shrink, pressing on me as the creature loomed larger, its glowing eyes locked on mine. The sound of its breathing was like a low growl, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. My chest tightened as the realization hit me. This thing wasn't just stalking us, it was hunting. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, my heart racing faster than I could control. My mind screamed at me to run, to escape. But I couldn't move. It stepped closer, its long claws scraping against the concrete. The stench was unbearable now, rank, like rot and decay. I stumbled back, my legs finally moving, but it was too late. The thing lunged. The flashlight went flying from my hand, the beam spinning wildly, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. In the darkness, I felt it, its presence, suffocating and overpowering. A deafening screech rang out as something massive collided with me, pushing me to the ground. I gasped for breath, but the weight pressing down on me was unbearable. My chest felt as though it were being crushed, and I could hear the creature's terrible breath, hot and foul against my skin. And then, just as quickly as it had attacked, it stopped. I could feel its presence hovering above me, its glowing eyes still staring, unblinking. Something shifted in the darkness. The weight lifted, but the creature didn't move. For a moment, there was only silence, thick, suffocating silence. Then it came again. The scratching. The sound of claws, just behind me. I didn't dare look back. The air felt like it was closing in on me as I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. The creature, whatever it was still there, watching, waiting. I couldn't see it clearly anymore, but I felt its presence like a cold hand wrapping around my throat, tightening with every breath. I had to get out. But how? The tunnel was long, winding, and now it felt endless. I couldn't even remember which direction I had come from. Every turn, every shadow seemed to twist and distort as if the very space around me was alive, alive with something hungry. I took a tentative step backward, but my foot caught on something slick and wet. I looked down in a panic, my flashlight flickering in my hand. What I saw made my blood run cold. A trail of dark, viscous liquid stretched across the tunnel floor, leading deeper into the shadows. The same stuff that had coated the tracks earlier, sticky, foul-smelling. The moment I spotted it, I heard a noise, sharp, unnerving. A crackling, like the snapping of bones. The sound came from ahead of me. Something was moving. I spun around, my mind a blur of panic. There was no sign of the creature, but the sound of its movements was unmistakable. It was circling me, moving in a way that felt deliberate, as though it was toying with me. I needed to think. to find some way out of this. I tried to remember the map of the tunnels, the one we had studied when we first started this job. There was a maintenance exit somewhere nearby. It wasn't far, but it wasn't near either. My chances of making it were slim. But I couldn't just stand there, waiting for whatever it was to find me. I had to act. I pushed myself forward, forcing my legs to move. The tunnel seemed to stretch ahead of me, the darkness feeling more oppressive with each step. My flashlight barely illuminated the walls, the flickering beam dancing erratically across the damp concrete. Then I heard it, a sound like skittering, fast and erratic. Too many of them, moving all at once. I turned toward the noise, the light catching the faintest of shapes in the corner of my eye. Shadows. Dozens of them, darting across the walls. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. I had to run. I sprinted down the tunnel, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of someone following me was unmistakable now. The creatures were close, their claws scraping against the walls, their feet thudding softly against the floor. They were getting closer. The light from my flashlight flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, I heard a sharp hiss, followed by the unmistakable sound of something massive slithering closer, fast. Too fast. I didn't dare look behind me, but I could feel the heat of its breath, the low growl of whatever nightmare was chasing me. My heart was racing, each beat a drum in my ears. I felt the familiar pull of terror in my gut, the sense that I was being hunted by something ancient and relentless. I had to make it to the maintenance exit. I wouldn't let it end here. But the tunnel seemed endless. The walls blurred past me as I ran, my legs heavy, my body trembling with exhaustion. The air was thick with the stench of decay, my senses overwhelmed by the oppressive darkness around me. Every step I took felt like it was dragging me deeper into the abyss. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but I knew no one would hear. I heard the scuttling again, closer now, almost directly behind me. I dared to glance over my shoulder, but all I saw was darkness, thick and unyielding. There was no sign of the creatures, but I could feel them there, just out of sight, lurking, waiting. They were hunting me. I pushed myself harder, faster, but the sound grew louder, closer. The creatures were on my heels. I could hear their breath, their claws scraping against the floor. They were gaining on me. And then it happened. A shadow appeared before me, blocking the tunnel, too large to be anything human. It wasn't just one of them, there were several, their eyes gleaming, glowing in the darkness. I stopped dead in my tracks, my stomach dropping, my body frozen in place. They were closing in. I spun around, trying to find another way. But the tunnel was a labyrinth, and I had no idea where I was anymore. I could feel their eyes on me, the weight of their gaze suffocating, the sharp, hissing sounds getting louder as they moved closer. I stumbled backward, hitting something cold and hard, a wall. Panic surged through me. There was nowhere to go. No way to escape. The creatures were upon me now, their forms becoming clearer in the dim light of my flashlight. They were monstrous, massive, with long, twisted limbs, their eyes glowing with an unearthly hunger. Their teeth glistened in the darkness, sharp and yellowed, and their breath stank of death. I could hear them breathing, low and labored, as they circled around me. My pulse hammered in my ears, my body trembling in terror. I tried to move, but my legs refused to cooperate. One of them lunged, and I barely had time to react. Its claws raked across my arm, tearing through the fabric of my jacket, the pain searing through my skin. I screamed in agony, my vision blurring, but I couldn't think. I had to survive. The shadowy creatures closed in, and I knew then that my time was running out. They weren't going to let me go. They were going to tear me apart, piece by piece. But then, in the distance, I saw it, a faint light, a glimmer of hope. The maintenance exit. I had to reach it. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed forward, stumbling, barely able to keep my feet under me. I could feel them closing in, their claws scraping against the floor, but I couldn't stop. I had to make it. I was so close. So close. And then everything went black. I awoke in darkness. Cold, suffocating darkness. I could barely breathe. My chest felt heavy, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on me. The sharp, stinging pain in my arms sent a wave of nausea through me. Where was I? I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. Panic gripped me, my thoughts racing as I fought to open my eyes. Slowly, they fluttered open, but the world around me was indistinct, shadowy, and muffled. My mind screamed at me to remember, to understand what had happened. I had been running for my life, but now I was somewhere else. The memories flooded back in fragments. The creatures, the tunnel, their glowing eyes. The moment I had seen the maintenance exit, the last desperate push to get there. And then, nothing. Had I made it? I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any sign of life. The silence was unbearable. But then I heard something, a faint scratching, followed by the unmistakable skittering of claws on metal. I froze. My pulse spiked, and my heart began to race again. I wasn't alone. Slowly, cautiously, I tried to push myself up, my hands bracing against the cold floor. The pain in my arm was unbearable, but I forced myself to ignore it, focusing only on getting to my feet. The skittering was getting closer. I couldn't stay here. With a burst of energy, I pushed off the ground, stumbling to my feet, using the wall for support. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to steady myself, my heart pounding with a fear I couldn't control. The sound of movement grew louder, and I spun around, looking for the source. The darkness was all-consuming, but then, just as I thought I might lose my mind, I saw it. A shadow. A figure, moving too quickly to be human. It darted across the far wall, and then I saw another, and another. They were everywhere. I wasn't alone. I couldn't stay and fight. I couldn't even run. The creatures were too many, too fast. My only option was to hide. I turned, my eyes scanning the room. It was small, barely more than a maintenance room, but there was an old, rusted metal locker in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was the only cover I had. I stumbled toward it, each step feeling like an eternity. My legs were shaking, my body screaming for rest, but I couldn't stop. Not now. The skittering grew louder, and I could feel the creatures drawing nearer. Their presence was overwhelming, like an invisible force closing in on me. I reached the locker and quickly pulled it open, shoving myself inside. The air inside was stifling, and the smell of oil and mildew made my stomach churn. But I didn't care. I pressed myself against the back wall, holding my breath as I waited. The creatures were close now, their claws scraping against the metal, their low hisses vibrating through the walls. I could hear them breathing, the sound wet and rasping. My pulse was a drumbeat in my ears, my heart thudding in my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to shut out the sounds, the fear. But it was impossible. The darkness, the silence, and the creatures closing in on me were all I could think about. And then, just when I thought I might go mad, it happened. A scream. A human scream echoing through the tunnels. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat. Someone else was down here. It wasn't just me. I didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. Whoever it was, they were in just as much danger as I was. I wanted to shout out to them, to warn them, but I couldn't. If I did, I would give away my position, and then there would be no hope for either of us. I could hear the creature's movements growing more frantic now, the sound of claws scraping against metal intensifying. They were agitated, hungry. Then came the low growl, the one that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just the creatures that were hunting. There was something else down here, something that controlled them. Something far worse. And then, as if it had all been a trap, the locker door was ripped open. I barely had time to react before I was pulled out, my body thrown to the cold, hard floor. I gasped, trying to push myself up, but I was too slow. The creatures were on me. Their glowing eyes were everywhere, their teeth gnashing, their claws digging into my skin. I screamed, but it was swallowed up by the oppressive darkness. A sharp pain in my side. And then everything went black. The pain in my side was unbearable, burning through every nerve in my body. It felt like the world was spinning out of control, and I couldn't tell which way was up. I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth was dry, my body too weak to move. Then, I felt something cold and wet on my face. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my vision, but everything was blurred, indistinct. The world around me was a swirl of shadows, and I could hear faint echoes, whispers, voices, but they were far away. Another sharp pain lanced through my side. I gasped, clutching at my stomach, feeling the wetness of my blood on my hands. The creatures were still there, their claws scraping against the concrete, their eyes gleaming with hunger. They were circling me, but there was something else, something more ominous lurking in the shadows. A low growl echoed in the darkness, sending a chill down my spine. It wasn't the creatures. It was something deeper, something more terrifying. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel its presence in the very air, a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I tried to sit up, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I could barely move. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls tightening as though they were alive, pressing in on me from all sides. Then, I saw it. A figure. Tall, shadowed, its outline barely visible in the gloom. It stood motionless in the corner, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. It wasn't like the creatures, this thing was something else entirely. It was larger. More human in shape, but with an unnatural, otherworldly presence. Its eyes, no, its gaze, was like a pull, like gravity itself. I felt it drawing me in, and my heart began to race uncontrollably. I tried to look away, to escape, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, trapped between the darkness and the unknown. The creatures around me were still prowling, their sharp claws scratching against the ground, but their attention was focused elsewhere. It was as if this figure commanded them, as if they feared it. The creature stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate. Its breath was heavy, labored, as if the very act of being in this place was draining it, but it still moved closer to me. The sound of its footsteps echoed in the silence, and each one felt like a countdown. Time was running out. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely a rasp. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond. It just watched. And then, as if responding to some unspoken command, the creatures lunged at me, their teeth sinking into my flesh. The pain was instantaneous, all-consuming, but it didn't last long. My vision started to fade, the edges of the world blurring into darkness. The last thing I saw was the figure standing over me, its eyes glowing, cold and infinite. And then there was nothing. Wealth of shadows. It began as a whisper in the mountain town of Eldridge, nestled in the heart of Colorado. A whisper that traveled through the tight-knit community of miners and traders, a rumor so bizarre that it was initially dismissed as just another tall tale. Yet, despite their best efforts to ignore it, people could not help but be drawn to the strange occurrences. Gold, real gold, was surfacing in the wilderness. Shiny veins, piles of gold nuggets, hidden deep within the forest, where none had mined before. I had heard the rumors too, of course. Being a part of Eldridge for over 10 years, working the mines myself, I knew the land like the back of my hand. But something felt wrong this time. A warning, buried deep in my gut, tugged at me as the stories grew louder. One by one, men and women had ventured into the mountains, eager to claim what was being offered. But none returned the same. There were stories of madness, of violent outbursts, of people losing their grip on reality. And it wasn't just the miners, there were whispers about families, even children, drawn to the allure of the golden riches and changing in ways that no one could explain. I remember the first time I heard the call of the gold, late one evening at the local tavern. You wouldn't believe it, Tom, an old miner who had seen his share of riches, leaned over the bar, his voice trembling. "There's more of it. And it's different. Not like the gold we know. It's cursed, I tell you." At first, I thought it was just another one of Tom's wild stories. But when I looked into his eyes, the deep, hollow pits of terror staring back at me, I realized this wasn't the same. Tom had never been a man to believe in curses. Something had shifted in him, something dark, something I couldn't place. That night, after closing time, I couldn't shake the thought. I lay awake in bed, listening to the wind howling outside. My mind wouldn't settle. For the first time in years, I felt like a fool for staying in a town that, despite all its beauty, had long since seen better days. My father had been a miner, and I followed in his footsteps, digging for riches in the hills, the promise of fortune never far from my thoughts. But this was different. The gold, as they said, was never where it should have been. The veins weren't where the maps said, and the nuggets weren't found in the places where miners had always searched. They were appearing like shadows in places that should have been untouched. I couldn't help but wonder if the land itself had decided to fight back, if there was something more to the whispers than superstition. And so, I found myself standing at the edge of the forest the very next day, alone, with nothing but my axe and a shovel. My heart raced in my chest as I stared at the dark expanse of trees, the wind picking up again and carrying with it an odd scent, something metallic, like blood. I told myself I was being foolish. I had lived through storms, rock slides, and near-death accidents in the mines. I had faced fear and come out unscathed, but something about the forest today felt different. As if it were watching me, waiting for me to make my move. But I was already too far in. With each step, the air grew heavier. The weight of the trees pressing down on me, the shadows growing deeper. The gold was out there. Somewhere. I could feel it. It was calling me, whispering from the trees, through the rustling leaves. It was a temptation I couldn't ignore. And as I walked deeper into the wilderness, a thought kept echoing in my mind: if it seems too good to be true, it always is. But still, my feet carried me forward. The promise of wealth was too alluring, too strong to turn back now. A sound broke through the silence, a soft, scraping noise, like metal on stone. I paused, my heart racing. I thought it was just the wind, but then the noise came again, louder this time, followed by a faint, metallic gleam from under the rocks ahead. Gold. I knew it without seeing it. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, in the way the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was wrong, but my hands reached for it before my mind could catch up. The instant I touched it, a chill ran through my spine. It wasn't just the cold of the mountain air. No, it was something else. A creeping, icy terror that seeped into my bones. The gold was wrong. It was beautiful, yes, but there was a darkness to it. An unnatural glow. It felt like it was alive, like it was drawing me in, slowly, gently, but with an insidious pull. I pulled my hand back, and a voice, soft, almost inaudible, whispered from the trees. Stay. Stay and take it all. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I stepped back, panic setting in. I had been warned. I knew I should leave, but the gold called me again. It took everything in me to turn and run, my feet stumbling over the rocks as I fled the scene. But something inside me wasn't the same as when I had entered those woods. As I stumbled out of the forest, the sunlight seemed brighter, the air fresher. But deep down, I knew something had changed. I could feel the weight of the gold I had touched still clinging to me, like an invisible hand gripping my soul. That night, I lay awake in bed, trying to dismiss the thoughts that haunted me. But the whispers lingered. They followed me into the dark. And in the silence of my room, I could almost hear it. Come back for more. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. All I could hear was the whispering, the call of that gold, that strange, unsettling promise of wealth. It lingered in my mind like a song you can't escape. I knew I had to stay away, but every thought, every waking moment was consumed by the memory of it. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. A moment of weakness, perhaps. But deep down, I knew the truth. That gold, it wasn't just precious, it was dangerous. A trap. And now I was caught in it. The town wasn't the same anymore either. People who had gone into the mountains, those who had found gold, came back altered. At first, it was subtle, fidgeting hands, vacant stares. But then, it escalated. Tom, who had once been full of stories and laughter, was now a shell of himself. His eyes were hollow, his movements jerky, as if he were battling something inside him. I visited him one evening, unable to ignore the concern gnawing at me. His small house was dark, the air heavy with the scent of stale bread and wet earth. He didn't greet me at the door, and when I stepped inside, I found him sitting in a corner of his living room, staring at the wall with a vacant look. The room was silent, the only sound the distant creaking of wood and the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel. "Tom?" I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Tom, what happened to you?" He didn't answer at first. His eyes flickered towards me, and then, with a sudden jerk, he stood up. His movements were sharp and erratic, as if he had just woken from a nightmare. Don't touch the gold," he rasped, his voice a broken whisper. It's not what you think. It's alive. He sank back down into the chair, his eyes wild, his breath ragged. His hands trembled, gripping the armrests of the chair like they were the only things keeping him anchored to reality. What do you mean? Tom, you've got to tell me, I insisted, stepping closer, trying to shake him from his haze. What's happening to you? You're scaring me. He turned his gaze toward me, and for the first time, I saw the fear, real, palpable fear, etched into his face. It takes you, slowly. At first, it's just the gold calling. You think it's all about the money, but then, it starts whispering, pulling at your thoughts. It feels so real, so powerful. And then it breaks you. He paused, his eyes unfocused as if seeing something beyond me. The gold, it gets into your head. You can't escape it. It's watching you, always watching, waiting for you to come back. His voice dropped to a near inaudible whisper. And when you do, it will take everything. Everything you are. The words settled in my mind, twisting and gnawing like a rope. I stepped back, my heart pounding. Was it true? Had he lost his mind? Or had he seen something that I couldn't? Before I could respond, he grabbed my wrist with a force that startled me. His grip was cold, his skin clammy. Get out of here, he urged, his voice frantic. You have to leave before it gets you too. You've touched it, haven't you? You felt it. I know you did. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I realized he was right. He knew. Somehow, he knew. Stay away from the mountain, he continued, his words trembling. It's not just gold. It's something worse. Something ancient. Something hungry. I yanked my arm free, stumbling back towards the door. His words echoed in my mind as I left his house, the world outside feeling more distant and hollow than before. The air was thick, like I was walking through molasses, as though the very atmosphere was conspiring to suffocate me. But there was no escaping it. The call of the gold. The whisper. I couldn't ignore it any longer. For the next few days, I tried to bury myself in work, in the mundane tasks that had once brought me peace. But it was useless. The town seemed to be unraveling. People who had once been grounded, steady, were becoming more and more unhinged. At the market, I overheard conversations about strange dreams, about voices in the dark, about seeing things, shadows that moved of their own accord, strange figures standing at the edges of the town at night. The town, once a close-knit community, was now filled with paranoia and fear. It was as if everyone knew, deep down, that something was wrong, something was coming. But no one dared speak of it. Everyone was afraid. And I couldn't shake the thought. The gold. What if it was all true? What if the curse was real? What if it wasn't just a matter of wealth, but of something far darker? That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The whisper. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. It called to me from the direction of the mountains, from the place I knew I shouldn't go. It was so quiet, so insidious, that I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. But then, a chill ran through me as the voice became clearer. Come back, it said. Come back and take what's yours. I pulled the covers tighter around me, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to drown out the sound. But it didn't stop. It never stopped. In the silence of my room, I realized I couldn't run anymore. I had to go back. The decision gnawed at me with every passing hour. I should have left. I should have packed up and fled the town. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. The pull of the gold, the way it seemed to call out to me, was too powerful. It wasn't just about the wealth anymore. It was about something else, something darker. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, tightening with each passing moment. The next day, I set out toward the mountains. I didn't tell anyone. There was no one to talk to anyway. Everyone else had already gone mad. The town, once full of life, was now eerily quiet. It felt like the calm before a storm, and I was walking straight into its eye. The path was familiar, the woods surrounding the town thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The sun was barely peeking through the canopy, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. I tried to ignore the discomfort that settled over me as I walked. There was something about the place that felt wrong now, like I wasn't just walking through the forest, but through a different reality, one where time and space didn't behave as they should. I walked for hours, my boots crunching through the dry leaves and twigs beneath me. As the day wore on, I began to notice something strange. The deeper I went into the mountains, the less I could hear. The wind, which had been howling earlier, died down. The birds, the rustling of animals, the normal sounds of the forest, they were gone. The silence was absolute. It was as though the world itself had closed in on me. And then I saw it. The clearing was ahead. It was the same one I had walked through weeks ago, the same one where I had first seen the gold. But now it was different. The air was thick, oppressive. A low hum seemed to vibrate through the ground, a sound so subtle I couldn't be sure if I was hearing it or just imagining it. But it was there, pulsing like a heartbeat. I hesitated for a moment, a flash of doubt crossing my mind. What if Tom had been right? What if this was a mistake? But then, I saw the gold again, scattered across the ground, glittering in the dim light like the eyes of a predator waiting to strike. I knelt down, reaching out for it, and as my fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface, a shudder ran through me. It wasn't just the cold. It was as though the gold was alive. There was a strange energy to it, a pull I couldn't explain. And then, I heard it. A sound that froze my blood. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint scraping, like something dragging across the ground. But then it grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the shadows at the edge of the clearing. The same shadows that had been empty before. The same place I had seen nothing just moments ago. I stood up, my heart racing in my chest, my breath shallow. The scraping continued, then suddenly stopped. Silence again, and then, slowly, I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but as it stepped into the pale light of the clearing, I realized it wasn't human. It was large, far larger than any animal I had ever seen. Its body was long, dark, and sleek, and its movements were unnaturally smooth. The eyes. The eyes were the worst part. They glowed with a sickly yellow light, reflecting the faint light from the gold like two burning embers. It was a rat. But not any rat. It was a giant, monstrous thing, the size of a bear, with sharp claws and jagged teeth that glistened in the dim light. Its fur was matted, dark, and its body was covered in scars and wounds, as if it had been living in the tunnels of the earth for centuries. I stepped back, my legs trembling, my mind racing. What the hell was this thing? How was it here? The rat's head tilted, its eyes locking onto mine. The hum that had filled the air before intensified, vibrating in my chest, as if it was coming from the creature itself. I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring into those eyes, feeling its gaze pierce me like a knife. And then, a voice. It wasn't a sound, not in the way we understand words. It was a presence, a force that filled my mind, a whisper that slid into my thoughts and settled there like a cold, creeping mist. It's too late. You've already touched the gold. You belong to us now. I gasped, stumbling back as if I had been struck. The world around me seemed to blur, the shadows deepening, the light from the gold flickering like a dying flame. The creature moved closer, its claws scraping against the stone beneath its feet. You'll never leave. The gold is ours. The mountain is ours. And now, you are ours. I tried to turn and run, but my legs refused to cooperate. It was as if the air itself was thick with the weight of its presence, holding me in place, suffocating me. The creature was upon me now, its hot breath on my face, its yellow eyes gleaming. The stench of decay filled my nostrils, and I fought the urge to vomit. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and for a moment everything seemed to slow down. And then, without warning, it lunged. I don't remember much after that. There was pain, a suffocating, overwhelming pressure, and then, nothing. I woke up back in the town, lying on the cold earth at the edge of the clearing. The gold was gone. The creature was gone. But the mark it had left on me wasn't. It had torn something inside me, something deep and essential. I couldn't explain what had happened. I didn't know if it was real or if I had imagined the whole thing. But the voice, the creature, the gold, they were real. I could feel them still, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting for me to come back. And I knew, with a cold certainty, that I would. Because whatever it was, whatever the gold, the mountain, and the thing beneath it wanted, it had already claimed me. The days after the encounter blurred into a haze of confusion and dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to slip, to give in. The gold was gone from the clearing, but the town felt different, as though the very air had changed. It was colder now, even in the height of summer. The people who remained, those few who hadn't already fled, were quieter, their eyes darting nervously as though they, too, could feel the weight of something unnatural pressing down on them. I tried to go back to my old routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. The walls of my small cabin, once a comfort, now felt like they were closing in on me. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind, seemed to whisper my name, reminding me of what I had touched, what I had summoned. At night, I could hear it. The scratching, the scraping, faint at first, like the sound of claws on stone. But it grew louder, closer, until it was impossible to ignore. It was the same sound I had heard in the clearing, the same sound that had accompanied the creature's arrival. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I knew better. It wasn't my mind. It was real. I started to avoid the woods altogether, but even that didn't help. The town had a suffocating silence now. People spoke in hushed tones, their faces drawn and tired. There was an undercurrent of fear in every glance exchanged, a shared understanding that something had shifted. I wasn't the only one who had felt it. They had, too. I tried to reach out to Tom, but his response was a strange, cryptic message. "Stay away from the mountains," he had written. "It's already too late. You'll understand soon." His words didn't reassure me, they terrified me. Had he experienced something similar? Had he been there, too? I tried to call him, but the number didn't connect. The phone rang once, twice, and then there was nothing. I couldn't sit still anymore. The paranoia, the overwhelming sense that something was closing in on me, was too much to bear. I had to find answers. I had to understand what had happened in the clearing. Why I felt like I was being hunted, even in the safety of my own home. And so, against every instinct telling me to stay away, I found myself standing at the edge of the mountain trail once again. The air was thick with a damp fog that clung to my skin, making it feel as if the very mountain was alive. The trees swayed in the breeze, but it wasn't a comforting motion. It felt like they were watching me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I knew I was being drawn back to the place I had left. The clearing. The gold. The creature. I couldn't explain it, but the pull was undeniable. Every step I took felt like I was moving deeper into something dark, something ancient. The very earth seemed to hum with an energy that I couldn't ignore. As I reached the clearing, I felt it, the same weight in the air, the same oppressive silence. The trees surrounding it seemed to close in, as though they were trapping me there. The ground beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy, as if it had absorbed something over time, something I couldn't see but could feel. And then, I saw it again. The gold. It was scattered across the ground, gleaming in the dim light that filtered through the fog. But this time, it wasn't just a pile of precious metal. It was more alive, somehow. Pulsing, shifting, as though it was breathing. I stepped closer, unable to stop myself, my fingers trembling as they reached toward the glimmering pile. The closer I got, the more intense the pull became. It wasn't just about the gold. It was as though the entire mountain was calling to me, its voice low and insistent in the back of my mind. I felt a presence behind me, and before I could turn around, I heard it, a sound like rustling fur, the skittering of claws on stone. It was closer than before, the air thick with its approach. I spun around, and there it was. The creature. The giant rat, its eyes glowing in the dim light, reflecting the faint shimmer of the gold. It was no longer a distant fear. It was real, standing right before me. It bared its teeth, a low growl escaping from its throat, vibrating the air around us. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in the same presence that had filled my mind before. A voice that was both deep and ancient, like the earth itself. You cannot leave. Not now. Not after what you have done. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring into the glowing eyes of the beast, feeling the weight of its gaze bore into me. The gold calls to you. It always does. It has claimed you, just as it has claimed this land. It has claimed us all. I tried to scream, to run, but the words caught in my throat. The creature was closer now, its hot breath swirling around me like a living nightmare. Its claws scraped against the earth, and I felt the ground beneath me shift, the weight of the mountain pressing down on me. It is too late for you. You will never escape. The fog thickened, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The creature's eyes never left mine, and I could feel the darkness closing in. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the gleam of the gold, its pull irresistible, drawing me into the abyss. When I awoke, I was back in the town. The clearing was gone. The gold was gone. But the feeling remained. The presence. It had followed me. I was never alone anymore. The town had changed. It was quiet, yes, but there was something else, something darker. I could feel eyes on me all the time, even in the stillness. The whispers, the shadows, they were all around me now. The gold, the creature, the mountain, they were never far. And deep down, I knew it. I knew that it wasn't over, that I would never truly be free, because the gold had taken me. And now, there was no going back. The gold has a way of claiming those who seek it. It doesn't care about the past. It doesn't care about who you were before. All it wants is to be touched, to be taken, to be owned. And once it has you, it never lets go. No one in the town ever talks about the mountain. We all pretend it never happened. But we all know. We all feel it just beneath the surface. Because the gold was never just about wealth. It was about control. And I am its prisoner. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.